Some monsters do not just steal lives, they obsessively preserve them in chilling archives of private photographs, journals, and videos that capture their victims' final, agonizing moments. While stringent platform guidelines prevent us from exposing the raw, unfiltered reality of these harrowing personal troves, the meticulously verified facts surrounding these 10 unimaginable collections will plunge you directly into the darkest, most terrifying corners of the human mind. The late 1970s in Southern California represented an era where the sun-drenched culture of beachgoers and carefree hitchhikers masked a creeping, unseen darkness that preyed upon the inherent trust of young women and children. Amidst this backdrop of shifting cultural norms and lax security, a man named Rodney Alcala managed to seamlessly integrate himself into the vibrant social fabric of Los Angeles by masquerading as a professional fashion photographer. Armed with a charismatic demeanor, undeniable physical appeal, and an exceptionally high IQ that he weaponized to manipulate those around him, Alcala easily convinced countless aspiring models to accompany him to secluded areas for impromptu photo shoots. He possessed an uncanny ability to disarm his targets, often leveraging his genuine educational background, which included time spent studying film at New York University under the guidance of renowned director Roman Polanski, to lend an air of absolute legitimacy to his photographic endeavors. Behind the lens of his camera, Alcala was not merely capturing the beauty of the era's youth, he was meticulously cataloging potential victims, freezing their innocence in a silver halide emulsion before subjecting them to unimaginable horrors. Among the sprawling, sun-baked streets of Huntington Beach, 12-year-old Robin Samsoe was living a perfectly ordinary, idyllic childhood, spending her summer afternoons riding bicycles with her friends and enjoying the coastal breeze. Robin represented the quintessential innocence of the time, a bright, energetic young girl whose daily routine consisted of navigating safe, familiar neighborhoods, entirely oblivious to the predatory figures that occasionally drifted through her community. Her family and friends knew her as a deeply trusting and joyful child, whose vibrant presence brought warmth to their everyday lives, and whose sudden absence would soon leave an incomprehensible void in the community. The community itself functioned on a baseline of assumed safety, where parents routinely allowed their children to roam freely until dusk, operating under the tragic misconception that daylight and familiar surroundings offered absolute protection against violent crime. It was precisely this tragically misplaced sense of communal security that allowed a wolf in sheep's clothing to wander into a local ballet class and cast his predatory gaze upon young Robin, setting the stage for a devastating collision between innocent adolescence and deeply entrenched, pathological evil. The fragile illusion of safety was permanently shattered on the afternoon of June 20, 1979, when Robin Samsoe vanished without a single trace while riding her bicycle to a highly anticipated ballet lesson in Huntington Beach. The inciting anomaly that shifted this from a standard missing persons case to a targeted abduction was the testimony of Robin's friend, who vividly recalled an interaction with a strange, dark-haired man offering to take their photographs on the beach shortly before Robin's disappearance. This crucial eyewitness account provided law enforcement with their first tangible lead, suggesting that the perpetrator was utilizing photography not just as a hobby, but as a calculated lure to establish immediate, unquestioned rapport with vulnerable children. A police sketch artist worked meticulously with the young friend to produce a composite drawing of the suspect, capturing the distinct, rugged features and the piercing gaze of the man who had approached them with a camera. The distribution of this composite sketch across local news broadcasts and neighborhood bulletins served as the definitive point of no return for the community, transforming a localized tragedy into a frantic, county-wide manhunt for a predator hiding in plain sight. 12 agonizing days after the initial disappearance, the grim reality of the situation materialized when a forensic search team discovered Robin's brutally mutilated remains scattered across a remote, densely wooded ravine in the foothills of the Sierra Madre Mountains. The horrific condition of the crime scene immediately escalated the urgency of the investigation. as detectives recognized the forensic signatures of a highly organized and profoundly sadistic offender who was likely completely comfortable operating within this geographical terrain. When the composite sketch finally caught the attention of Alcala's own parole officer, who instantly recognized the facial structure and the distinctive curly hair of the convicted felon under his supervision, the trajectory of the entire investigation narrowed significantly. The sudden intersection of a missing child's tragic fate with the established criminal record of a known sexual offender provided detectives with the exact leverage they needed to begin dismantling Alcala's carefully constructed farce. 8 of artistic professionalism. This pivotal identification shifted the narrative from a desperate search for an unknown phantom to a highly focused, intense scrutiny of Rodney Alcala, setting off a chain reaction of investigative discoveries that would ultimately expose a labyrinth of documented terror, extending far beyond a single tragic afternoon in Huntington Beach. As Huntington Beach detectives began peeling back the layers of Rodney Alcala's life, they were immediately confronted by a deeply disturbing criminal history that highlighted catastrophic systemic failures within the justice system itself. Investigators discovered that Alcala had previously fled to New York after brutally assaulting an 8-year-old girl in Hollywood, a crime for which he had been extradited, convicted, and shockingly paroled after serving a vastly inadequate sentence. The tension escalated dramatically when background checks revealed the surreal and chilling fact that Alcala had actually appeared as the winning contestant on the popular television show, The Dating Game, right in the midst of his active killing spree, openly broadcasting his terrifying charisma to a national audience. Armed with a search warrant, forensic teams descended upon Alcala's Southern California residence, meticulously combing through his belongings in search of any physical evidence linking him directly to the abduction and murder of Robin Samsoe. Within the confines of his home, investigators uncovered a chilling receipt for a rented storage locker situated far away in Seattle, Washington. A seemingly innocuous piece of paper that immediately raised red flags regarding hidden contraband or concealed evidence of further crimes. Detectives hastily coordinated with law enforcement in Washington state to secure and breach the Seattle storage unit, operating under the suspicion that Alcala was using this remote location as a secure vault for his darkest secrets. What they found inside the dimly lit locker completely shattered the scope of the original investigation, transforming it from a single homicide inquiry into one of the most prolific serial killer cases in American history. Neatly organized within the storage unit were hundreds upon hundreds of photographs, meticulously archived and carefully preserved, featuring young women, teenage girls, and small children in various states of undress and profound vulnerability. The sheer volume and systematic categorization of these images indicated a terrifying level of predatory organization, as investigators realized they were looking directly at the personal trophies of a man who obsessively documented his hunting expeditions. Each captured expression in the photographs sparked a frantic, nationwide effort to identify the subjects, with detectives agonizing over whether the faces looking back at them belonged to living survivors or entirely unknown, undiscovered victims of Alcala's relentless photographic predation. The climactic breakthrough in the case did not come from a dramatic confession or an intense interrogation room showdown, but rather from a tiny, deeply personal item recovered during the exhaustive forensic sweep of the Seattle storage unit. Hidden among the thousands of photographs and varied personal belongings, an incredibly observant investigator located a small pouch containing a pair of distinctive, gold ball earrings that immediately demanded uncompromising forensic scrutiny. These earrings were brought back to California and presented to the grieving family of Robin Samsoe, who definitively identified the jewelry as the exact pair the young girl had been wearing on the fateful afternoon she rode her bicycle to her ballet class. This critical piece of physical evidence formed an unbreakable, incontrovertible link between the brutalized remains found in the Sierra Madre foothills and the man who had been masquerading as a harmless, highly educated fashion photographer. The discovery of the earrings effectively checkmated Alcala, stripping away his arrogant defenses and providing prosecutors with the definitive, irrefutable proof required to charge him with capital murder in the first degree. As the trial proceedings unfolded, the courtroom transformed into a theater of the macabre, with Alcala violently insisting on representing himself and subjecting the victims' families to the profound psychological torture of his own aggressive, narcissistic cross-examinations. The true zenith of horror during the trial occurred when prosecutors entered the vast cache of Seattle photographs into evidence, projecting the haunting images of unknown women and children into the public record for the entire world to witness. This public display of his meticulously maintained archive exposed the absolute depths of Alcala's depravity, demonstrating beyond any reasonable doubt that his camera was an instrument of psychological subjugation utilized right before he committed extreme physical violence. The sheer weight of the photographic evidence, combined with the irrefutable physical connection established by Robin Samso's earrings, systematically dismantled every legal maneuver Alcala attempted to employ in his desperate bid to evade justice. The moment the jury handed down their final guilty verdict, the staggering reality of his undocumented atrocities settled heavily over the courtroom, confirming that this highly intelligent predator had operated a decades-long campaign of terror hidden entirely in plain sight. Rodney Alcala's journey through the American judicial system became a marathon of legal appeals and overturned sentences, but the overwhelming forensic evidence eventually secured him multiple death sentences in California, firmly locking him away on death row. Decades after his initial conviction, advancements in DNA technology allowed cold case detectives in New York to definitively link his biological profile to two additional, previously unsolved homicides from the 1970s, further expanding his confirmed body count. In a desperate effort to finally identify the remaining individuals captured in the Seattle storage unit, the Huntington Beach Police Department released a large portion of the recovered photographs to the public, leading to the agonizing realization that many of the women depicted had indeed been murdered or remain missing to this day. Alcala ultimately never faced the executioner's needle, instead dying of natural causes in a California prison hospital in 2021 at the age of 77, taking the true, comprehensive number of his victims with him to his grave. His legacy remains forever bound to those haunting portraits, a terrifying testament to a killer who utilized a lens to freeze his victims in absolute terror before violently stripping away their lives. The surviving families of his confirmed victims continue to grapple with the painful reality that the justice system initially failed to protect them from a predator whose violent tendencies were repeatedly documented yet tragically ignored. For the families of the women in the photographs who have never been identified, their grief is compounded by a suspended state of eternal ambiguity, forever wondering if their loved ones fell prey to the charismatic photographer with the exceptionally high IQ. The Alcala case fundamentally altered how law enforcement agencies view the intersection of violent crime and personal archiving, proving that the most damning evidence is often meticulously preserved by the killers themselves as grotesque souvenirs. His compulsive need to collect and catalog his conquests provided the very roadmap that ultimately led to his downfall, serving as a dark, psychological blueprint for investigators studying the behaviors of highly organized predators. While Alcala captured his victims' final moments on silent, still film, other deeply disturbed individuals chose to document their atrocities through much more active, agonizingly audible mediums. A horrifying reality that brings us directly to the heavily fortified, soundproofed nightmares constructed deep within the dense forests of Calaveras County. Deep within the rugged, heavily forested terrain of Calaveras County, California, the isolated community of Wilseyville offered a perfect sanctuary for individuals seeking to live entirely off the grid during the paranoid, survivalist-fueled atmosphere of the early 1980s. This dense, rural wilderness was an environment where privacy was fiercely guarded and neighbors rarely asked questions about the eccentricities or the heavily fortified compounds of those living just down the dirt road. To the outside world, Leonard Lake presented himself as a dedicated survivalist preparing for a hypothetical nuclear holocaust, utilizing the isolation of a rented cabin property to construct what he claimed was a necessary, defensive fallout shelter. In reality, Lake was a deeply disturbed former Marine whose apocalyptic fantasies provided the ultimate architectural cover for a highly organized, heavily fortified dungeon designed exclusively for the prolonged captivity and torture of innocent people. Among those who unwittingly intersected with this hidden nightmare were the Dubs family, Harvey, his wife Deborah, and their infant son Sean, who were simply attempting to sell a video camera to men they believed were legitimate buyers. The Dubs represented the everyday, trusting citizens of California who frequently engaged in casual commerce through newspaper classifieds, entirely unaware that their entrepreneurial efforts would lead them directly into a lethal trap. Victims like the Dubs family, or young women lured under the guise of modeling gigs and domestic employment, were systematically stripped of their normal lives and erased from existence within a meticulously constructed cinder block nightmare that swallowed them whole. The quiet, rustling pines of the Sierra Nevada foothills acted as a natural sound barrier, ensuring that the horrifying realities unfolding within the reinforced walls of the property remained completely undetected by local law enforcement or passing hikers. It was an environment perfectly curated for absolute control, where Lake, eventually joined by his equally sadistic accomplice Charles Ng, could play out a deeply ingrained, misogynistic manifesto without any immediate threat of discovery. The sheer remoteness of the Wilseyville cabin allowed the two men to operate with devastating impunity, methodically compiling a gruesome catalog of their atrocities, while the families of the missing languished in agonizing, desperate uncertainty back in the civilized world. The impenetrable veil of secrecy surrounding the Calaveras County compound was abruptly shattered not by a brilliant detective's deduction or a dramatic escape, but rather by a staggeringly mundane and careless act of petty theft in South San Francisco on June 2, 1985. Charles Ng, despite possessing access to vast amounts of stolen property and resources at the bunker, inexplicably decided to shoplift a heavy industrial vise from a local hardware store, immediately drawing the attention of an observant employee who alerted law enforcement. When police officers arrived at the scene to investigate the reported theft, they encountered Leonard Lake, who had been waiting in a vehicle in the parking lot and unwisely attempted to intervene and cover for his fleeing accomplice. As the responding officers began to question Lake, they noticed his extreme nervousness and immediately ran the license plates of his Honda Prelude, discovering to their surprise that the vehicle was officially registered to a man named Paul Cosner, who had been reported missing in San Francisco several months prior. A subsequent search of the vehicle yielded a terrifying cache of items, including a loaded revolver equipped with an illegal silencer, and further identification cards belonging to other missing individuals, fundamentally escalating the situation from a routine shoplifting response to a multi-agency critical incident. Faced with the sudden collapse of his hidden criminal empire and recognizing that the discovery of the car's contents would inevitably lead investigators straight to his Wilseyville torture chamber, Lake requested a moment of privacy to write a note to his ex-wife. While sitting in the holding cell at the police precinct, Lake quietly extracted a hidden capsule of cyanide that he had sewn into his clothing, ingesting the lethal poison in a final, cowardly act designed to permanently evade accountability for his crimes. His sudden collapse and subsequent death in a local hospital completely neutralized the primary suspect, leaving baffled investigators with a dead man, a stolen vehicle belonging to a missing person, and an unidentified accomplice who had successfully vanished into the urban sprawl. This bizarre, violent sequence of events served as the definitive point of no return for the investigation, transforming a disorganized parking lot arrest into an urgent, frantic search to uncover the true identity of the deceased man and the dark secrets he had chosen to die for. Law enforcement agencies quickly mobilized to trace the addresses associated with the various identification cards found in Lake's possession, a forensic trail that would ultimately guide them away from the concrete landscape of San Francisco and directly into the chilling, remote wilderness of Calaveras County. As investigators descended upon the secluded Wilseyville property, They were entirely unprepared for the staggering scale and the calculated architectural horror of the subterranean complex hidden behind the facade of a rustic mountain cabin. The search teams quickly uncovered a heavy, reinforced cinderblock structure buried deep into the hillside, outfitted with multiple hidden rooms, a one-way mirrored glass observation window, and heavily soundproofed walls specifically designed to completely muffle human screams. Inside this subterranean prison, detectives discovered a meticulous array of terrifying evidence, including a chilling written manifesto drafted by Lake-titled Operation Miranda, which detailed a deranged, misogynistic philosophy advocating for the kidnapping, subjugation, and enslavement of women. The property itself was transformed into an active, massive archaeological crime scene as forensic anthropologists and heavy excavation machinery were brought in to sift through the dense mountain soil surrounding the cabin and the bunker. Over the course of several agonizing weeks, search teams painstakingly unearthed a devastating volume of physical evidence, recovering nearly 45 pounds of charred, fragmented human remains alongside blood, stained clothing, driver's licenses, and credit cards belonging to at least 18 different missing persons. The sheer scope of the forensic recovery effort was unprecedented for the region, requiring investigators to meticulously piece together the identities of men, women, and 2 young infants who had been systematically lured to the property and erased from existence. As the grim inventory of the mass grave continued to expand, an intense international manhunt was simultaneously launched to locate the fugitive Charles Ng, who had managed to evade the initial police net and flee across the northern border into Canada. Ng utilized his survival skills and military background to live as a transient in the Canadian wilderness, surviving by committing a string of burglaries, while law enforcement agencies across North America continuously circulated his photograph and criminal profile. The investigation slowly mapped out the duo's predatory methodology, revealing how they specifically targeted vulnerable individuals through classified advertisements for employment or vehicle sales, exploiting everyday economic transactions to drag their victims into an inescapable, fortified nightmare. Every new bone fragment pulled from the Calaveras soil reinforced the horrifying reality that detectives were dismantling a highly efficient, mechanized killing ground operated by 2 men who had completely severed themselves from any semblance of human empathy. The absolute peak of investigative horror was reached when detectives, meticulously cataloging the thousands of items recovered from the Wilseyville compound, discovered a collection of unmarked VHS tapes carefully hidden within the cabin's extensive personal archive. When law enforcement officials finally placed these tapes into a standard videocassette player, they were instantly subjected to the most visceral, uncompromising evidence of pure evil imaginable, witnessing firsthand the absolute terror inflicted upon the victims in their final days. The grainy, degrading footage featured Lake and Ng casually parading before the camera, aggressively taunting and psychologically torturing their captive victims, who were visibly bound, terrified, and forced to endure horrific physical and emotional abuse within the suffocating confines of the cinderblock bunker. These devastating home movies stripped away any lingering ambiguity about the nature of the crimes, capturing the raw, unfiltered sadism of the perpetrators as they documented their absolute power over individuals whose lives they were about to extinguish. The visual confirmation of the victims' suffering provided an ironclad, undeniable record of premeditated, aggravated murder, fundamentally traumatizing the seasoned investigators who were forced to review the material to build their prosecutorial case. Simultaneously, the sprawling manhunt for Charles Ng culminated in an explosive, violent confrontation thousands of miles away in a department store in Calgary, Alberta, where the fugitive was once again caught attempting to shoplift minor grocery items. When confronted by store security personnel, Ng drew a concealed firearm and engaged in a desperate, close-quarters struggle, shooting a security guard in the hand before being violently subdued and taken into custody by responding Canadian police officers. The discovery of Ng's true identity sent shockwaves through the international law enforcement community, effectively ending his month-long evasion and setting the stage for one of the most complex, protracted legal battles in North American judicial history. The intersection of the recovered Calavera's bunker videotapes and the dramatic, violent capture of the surviving architect of the nightmare provided prosecutors with the definitive, irrefutable ammunition required to seek the maximum possible penalty under the law. This definitive, undeniable combination of recovered visual horror and sudden physical apprehension firmly closed the investigative chapter on the bunker, transitioning the battle from the desolate wilderness directly into the uncompromising arena of the international justice system. The legal aftermath of the Wilseyville horrors devolved into a grueling, decade-long procedural marathon, primarily stalled by Charles Ng's aggressive, manipulative efforts to endlessly delay his extradition from Canada, a country that staunchly opposed the death penalty. It required years of complex international diplomacy and a definitive ruling from the Supreme Court of Canada before Ng was finally forcibly returned to California jurisdiction to face justice for the overwhelming volume of physical and video evidence stacked against him. When the trial finally commenced in 1998, 13 years after the initial shoplifting arrest in South San Francisco, the courtroom was forced to endure the agonizing playback of the bunker tapes, ensuring the jury fully comprehended the absolute depravity of the defendant. Despite his relentless attempts to fire his legal counsel, fake physical ailments, and disrupt the judicial proceedings, the overwhelming forensic record and the horrific visual documentation secured his conviction on 11 counts of first-degree murder. Ng was subsequently sentenced to death and transferred to the heavily guarded confines of San Quentin State Prison, where he remains on death row today, waiting out the endless appeals process while the families of the victims continue to endure the permanent absence of their loved ones. The exact number of people who perished at the hands of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng will likely never be definitively confirmed, as the sheer volume of bone fragments recovered from the mountain compound suggests the true death toll could exceed 25 individuals. The Wilseyville case fundamentally altered the landscape of criminal profiling, demonstrating how highly organized predators will go to extraordinary lengths to construct physical environments dedicated solely to the concealment and documentation of their violence. While Lake and Ng relied on thick concrete walls, remote geography, and physical VHS cassettes to shield their recorded atrocities from the eyes of the world, the rapid evolution of technology was about to give rise to a terrifying new breed of offender. This dark compulsion to actively record a victim's final moments would soon move out of the subterranean dirt of the California mountains and migrate directly onto the glowing screens of the modern digital age. The boundless, unregulated reach of the early internet would soon provide the ultimate broadcasting platform for our next subject, a dangerous narcissist who sought not just to document his crimes, but to force the entire world to bear witness to them in real time. The advent of the internet fundamentally altered the landscape of human interaction, creating an unprecedented ecosystem where absolute anonymity could seamlessly coexist with a desperate, pathological craving for global notoriety. Within this sprawling digital frontier, the barrier to entry for infamy was drastically lowered, allowing individuals with deeply disturbed psychological profiles to cultivate massive, entirely fabricated online personas designed solely to attract attention. It was within this modern, hyper-connected reality that 33-year-old Jun Lin navigated his daily existence as an ambitious, remarkably dedicated international student residing in the vibrant, culturally rich city of Montreal, Canada. Having relocated from Wuhan, China, Lin represented the quintessential archetype of a hardworking immigrant, dedicating his days to rigorous computer science studies at Concordia University, while simultaneously maintaining a part-time job at a local convenience store to financially support his educational aspirations. His friends, family, and colleagues universally described him as a profoundly gentle, optimistic, and deeply trusting individual who possessed a quiet warmth and a genuine desire to build a successful, meaningful life far away from his homeland. Lin maintained a steady, reassuring presence in the lives of his loved ones, frequently communicating with his family in China through video calls and social media messages that documented his positive experiences and academic progress in North America. His daily routine was characterized by a predictable, comforting rhythm of attending university lectures, completing work shifts, and spending quiet evenings in his modest apartment, completely insulated from the darker, predatory elements that lurked beneath the surface of the city's nightlife. This predictable baseline of normalcy and diligent ambition made his eventual intersection with a deeply malignant, digitally obsessed predator all the more tragic, highlighting the devastating vulnerability of individuals operating with inherent goodwill in an increasingly complex world. Junlin simply sought connection and companionship in a foreign city, unaware that his inherent trust would be systematically exploited by an individual who viewed human life not as a sacred entity, but as a disposable prop necessary for the production of a real-life horror film. The collision between Lin's hopeful, upward trajectory and a meticulously engineered web of digital deception would soon result in a tragedy that forced law enforcement to confront a terrifying new breed of modern criminality. The terrifying convergence of the digital and physical realms was abruptly initiated on May 25, 2012, when a profoundly disturbing, highly produced video titled "One Lunatic, One Ice Pick" was anonymously uploaded to a notorious shock gore website operating on the fringes of the visible internet. This deeply grotesque, meticulously edited footage depicted the brutal, methodical murder and subsequent dismemberment of a bound, incapacitated young man, featuring a perpetrator whose face was intentionally obscured yet who performed for the camera with a sickening, theatrical arrogance. While local law enforcement initially struggled to verify the authenticity of this horrific digital broadcast, dismissing early reports as a potential hoax or elaborate practical joke, the grim reality of the situation rapidly materialized in the physical world just 4 days later. On May 29, the fragile veneer of a standard missing persons inquiry into the sudden, uncharacteristic silence of Junlin was permanently shattered when a blood-soaked, foul-smelling package was delivered directly to the national headquarters of the Conservative Party of Canada in Ottawa. This grisly postal delivery, which was soon followed by a heavily publicized discovery of a decapitated human torso, stuffed into a discarded suitcase behind a low-rent apartment complex in Montreal, forced authorities to immediately connect the escalating physical evidence with the viral digital nightmare. The undeniable forensic realization that the remains discovered in the Ottawa parcel and the Montreal alleyway belonged to the same individual depicted in the horrific online video marked the definitive point of no return for the entire investigation. Furthermore, the subsequent interception of additional macabre parcels mailed to schools in Vancouver only solidified the horrifying scope of his twisted distribution network. Montreal police were suddenly thrust into a chaotic, globally broadcasted crisis, realizing they were not merely hunting a traditional murderer, but a highly calculated, media-obsessed psychopath who was actively utilizing the National Postal Service to physically distribute the remnants of his atrocity. The investigation transformed instantly from a localized search into an urgent, high-stakes international emergency as detectives raced to secure the Montreal apartment, where the gruesome video had undeniably been filmed, desperate to identify the butcher before he could strike again or completely vanish into the digital ether. The intersection of the uploaded snuff film, the missing student report, and the intercepted biological packages provided investigators with a horrifyingly clear picture of a killer who craved absolute public recognition for his unprecedented barbarity. Upon breaching the suspect's hastily abandoned apartment in the working-class neighborhood of Des Neiges, forensic technicians were confronted with an overwhelming, blood-soaked crime scene that perfectly matched the distinct visual parameters meticulously recorded in the viral online video. Investigators quickly identified the tenant as Luca Rocco Magnata, a failed actor, former sex worker, and severe narcissist who had spent years obsessively cultivating a vast, entirely fabricated digital footprint consisting of dozens of fake social media profiles, self-penned fan pages, and heavily edited photographs designed to project an illusion of international fame. As detectives delved deeper into Magnata's dark internet history, They uncovered a terrifying, escalating pattern of documented cruelty, confirming that he had previously filmed and uploaded a series of horrific animal abuse videos, utilizing the agonizing deaths of kittens as a twisted rehearsal for his eventual graduation to human homicide. Armed with a definitive identity and a rapidly expanding profile of a desperate attention seeker, Canadian authorities initiated a massive, unprecedented digital forensics operation to track Magnotta's movements, only to discover that the killer had already boarded a transatlantic flight to Paris, France, hours before the severed torso was discovered. This revelation triggered the immediate issuance of an Interpol Red Notice, formally escalating the pursuit into a sprawling global manhunt that required the seamless coordination of multiple European law enforcement agencies, border control authorities, and international intelligence networks. The investigation became a high-stress race against time, with detectives continuously monitoring Magnotta's digital exhaust, tracking his cellular pings, internet logins, and ATM withdrawals as he navigated through the dense, bustling urban centers of Western Europe in a desperate bid to evade capture. Every digital breadcrumb he left behind, from internet cafe logins to surveillance camera footage, was rapidly analyzed by cyber units working around the clock to predict his next geographical move. The suspense peaked as French police narrowly missed apprehending him in a Parisian hotel room, discovering freshly discarded personal items and pornographic magazines that indicated the suspect was highly mobile, acutely aware of the pursuit, and potentially preparing to cross international borders once again. The massive media frenzy surrounding the case ironically aided the investigation, as Magnotta's unmistakable, heavily publicized face was plastered across global news networks, significantly shrinking the physical world in which this digitally obsessed fugitive could effectively hide. The relentless pressure of the international dragnet forced the killer deeper into the European continent, setting the stage for a surreal, almost cinematic confrontation where the virtual world he so desperately craved would ultimately serve as the direct catalyst for his physical downfall. The absolute pinnacle of this intense global pursuit materialized on June 4, 2012 within the mundane, brightly lit confines of a small internet cafe situated in the working-class Neukölln district of Berlin, Germany, far removed from the horrific crime scene in Montreal. An exceptionally observant cafe employee named Kadir Anliisli, who had been actively following the massive international news coverage of the Canadian dismemberment case, noticed a customer matching the suspect's distinct physical description walk into the establishment and quietly rent a computer terminal. As Anliisli discreetly observed the man's activities from a secure vantage point, the situation reached a crescendo of chilling, narcissistic absurdity when he realized the suspect was not communicating with family or attempting to secure travel arrangements, but was instead obsessively reading news articles and viewing photographs, entirely focused on himself and the ongoing manhunt. This surreal confirmation of the killer's identity, a man so pathologically consumed by his own infamy that he risked his freedom just to consume his own press coverage, prompted the employee to immediately step outside and flag down a passing German police patrol. When the armed officers confidently entered the cafe and approached the terminal, Magnotta initially attempted to offer a fabricated name and a counterfeit identity document. But the sheer weight of the global investigation and the inescapable reality of his cornered position quickly shattered his fragile facade. In a moment of quiet, almost resigned capitulation that sharply contrasted with the violent, theatrical arrogance displayed in his viral snuff film, the suspect simply looked at the German officers, softly stated his true name, and allowed himself to be placed into handcuffs without a physical struggle. The dramatic capture of Luca Magnotta represented an incredibly rare, perfectly synchronized intersection of global law enforcement cooperation, acute civilian situational awareness, and the perpetrator's own fatal psychological compulsion to actively monitor his digital legacy. The German authorities swiftly processed the fugitive, securing the digital devices he was utilizing and confirming his identity through international fingerprint databases, sent directly from Canadian law enforcement. The swift operational execution inside that Berlin cafe ensured that a highly dangerous, increasingly unpredictable offender was successfully removed from the streets without any further loss of life or public disruption. This decisive apprehension brought an immediate halt to his reign of terror, stripping away the perceived invincibility of his online persona and dragging him forcefully back into the uncompromising, rigidly structured reality of the international justice system. Following a complex international extradition process, Luca Magnotta was forcefully returned to Canadian soil under heavy tactical guard, completely stripped of the digital anonymity he had long exploited, and ultimately forced to face a meticulously structured trial in the very city where his atrocities occurred. In December 2014, after enduring weeks of excruciating testimony and the agonizing mandatory review of the visual and physical evidence by a highly traumatized jury, Magnotta was found guilty of first-degree murder, committing an indignity to a human body, and publishing obscene material, resulting in a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment. The tragic, enduring legacy of this case remains heavily focused on the profound grief of John Lynn's family, who were forced to endure not only the unimaginable physical loss of their beloved son, but also the horrific reality that his final, agonizing moments were permanently etched into the darkest corners of the internet. The Magnotta investigation fundamentally reshaped the global dialogue surrounding digital responsibility, heavily exposing the dangerous, unregulated nature of shock, gore websites and the devastating ethical implications of internet platforms that allow the unregulated broadcasting of extreme human suffering. Furthermore, the global outcry following the trial prompted severe crackdowns on the moderation policies of fringe internet domains, forcing tech companies to heavily reevaluate their stance on hosting materials depicting actual homicide. The Canadian justice system ultimately proved that while the internet can provide a temporary shield of anonymity, it also leaves an indelible, traceable path that determined investigators can follow directly to a killer's front door. Despite his incarceration, the digital footprint Magnotta so desperately sought to establish remains a highly toxic, cautionary tale studied by behavioral analysts, demonstrating the absolute extreme limits of narcissistic pathology when combined with modern broadcasting technology. The absolute finality of his concrete prison cell stands in stark, permanent contrast to the boundless, terrifying virtual realm he once utilized to project his monstrous capabilities to a global audience. While Magnotta weaponized the modern internet to push his recorded horrors out into the public sphere, other deeply organized predators have historically preferred to keep their meticulously documented archives intimately close to home. This chilling divergence in the preservation of terror leads us directly to the quiet, unassuming suburban streets of the American Midwest, where a seemingly harmless antique dealer transformed his private residence into a fortified chamber of documented, unimaginable agony. In the heart of the American Midwest during the 1980s, Kansas City, Missouri presented a facade of quiet, industrious normalcy, a sprawling urban environment where the boundaries between thriving suburban neighborhoods and overlooked, decaying districts created a landscape ripe for exploitation by a patient predator. Operating seamlessly within this environment was Robert Berdella, a remarkably unassuming man who cultivated a public persona as an eccentric but harmless local merchant, running an eclectic flea market booth, aptly named Bob's Bizarre Bazaar. To his neighbors on the seemingly peaceful Charlotte Street, Berdella was known as a community-oriented citizen who actively participated in the local neighborhood watch program, frequently reporting petty crimes and presenting himself as a dedicated guardian of suburban safety. His extensive collection of antiques, oddities, and occult items provided a perfect, quirky cover for a profoundly disturbed psychological profile, masking a deeply ingrained sadistic impulse that he kept entirely hidden from the patrons who casually browsed his wares on the weekends. While Berdella outwardly projected an image of a helpful, albeit unconventional, small business owner, he privately spent years identifying and cataloging the vulnerabilities of young men who existed on the absolute margins of society, recognizing that their disappearances would likely go unnoticed by the broader community. His primary targets were male sex workers, transient youths, and individuals severely compromised by substance abuse, people who were already disconnected from familial support systems and inherently distrustful of law enforcement interventions. By offering these desperate individuals temporary shelter, basic employment at his bizarre flea market booth, or access to illicit narcotics, Berdella systematically disarmed his prey, leveraging their immediate, pressing needs to lure them directly into the fortified privacy of his two-story residential home. The victims who stepped across the threshold of his property believed they were receiving a rare moment of charitable respite from the unforgiving streets, completely unaware that they were actually walking into a meticulously prepared, soundproofed torture chamber from which there would be no escape. This tragic exploitation of extreme societal vulnerability allowed Berdella to operate with terrifying impunity for years, transforming his quiet residential property into a localized black hole where human beings were routinely swallowed up without generating a single missing persons report or arousing the slightest suspicion from the surrounding community. The neighborhood functioned under the comfortable, devastatingly inaccurate assumption that monsters existed only in dark alleys and cinematic fiction, entirely oblivious to the reality that a highly organized, methodical butcher was operating directly next door behind drawn curtains and locked doors. The impenetrable veil of secrecy surrounding the horrors at 4315 Charlotte Street was abruptly and violently shattered on the early morning of April 2, 1988, marking a definitive, horrifying turning point that local law enforcement could never have anticipated. A 22-year-old man named Christopher Bryson, who had been held captive and subjected to unimaginable physical and psychological torment for nearly a week, managed to exploit a rare, momentary lapse in his captor's heavily regimented security protocols. Driven by the primal, absolute desperation of a man who definitively knew he was scheduled to be murdered, Bryson violently forced his way through a second-story window of Berdella's home, plummeting to the ground below, while wearing nothing but a heavy metal dog collar locked tightly around his neck. Despite suffering severe injuries from the fall and enduring the lingering, agonizing effects of the extensive physical trauma he had already sustained, Bryson scrambled frantically across the property line, seeking refuge on a neighboring porch and desperately begging for immediate police intervention. The profound shock experienced by the neighbor who discovered this battered, colored man pleading for his life instantly triggered a rapid, overwhelming police response that fundamentally disrupted the quiet weekend morning in the otherwise peaceful residential district. When Kansas City patrol officers arrived at the chaotic scene and began taking Bryson's preliminary statement, they were initially entirely overwhelmed by the sheer, incomprehensible brutality of the narrative he was forcefully articulating regarding the seemingly harmless antique dealer next door. However, the undeniable, raw physical evidence carved directly into Bryson's flesh, including extensive lacerations, puncture wounds, and the heavy metal collar itself, forced the responding officers to immediately transition from a state of skeptical inquiry to an urgent, highly tactical emergency response. Recognizing the absolute gravity of the situation and the immediate potential for further loss of life or the rapid destruction of critical forensic evidence, law enforcement officials swiftly established a heavily fortified perimeter around Berdella's residence. This desperate, bloody escape effectively served as the absolute point of no return for the Kansas City Police Department, transforming a shocking localized disturbance into a massive, multi-agency criminal investigation focused squarely on a respected, heavily entrenched member of the local community. The moment detectives secured a comprehensive search warrant and physically breached the threshold of Berdella's seemingly ordinary house, they officially crossed over from the realm of routine police work directly into a suffocating, documented nightmare that would permanently alter the history of American true crime. As specialized forensic teams systematically navigated the cluttered, dimly lit interior of the Charlotte Street residence, they were instantly confronted with an overwhelming stench of chemical solvents and decomposition that heavily hinted at the extreme atrocities committed within the walls. The investigative focus rapidly centered on the upstairs bedrooms and the basement, which had been methodically converted into highly secure holding cells equipped with heavy chains, specialized restraints, and an extensive array of medical and electrical equipment entirely incongruous with a standard residential dwelling. The true, devastating scope of Berdella's crimes was not revealed through physical remains alone, but rather through the discovery of his meticulously maintained, profoundly clinical torture logs, which he had obsessively updated over the course of several years. Detectives uncovered extensive handwritten journals in which Berdella had dispassionately recorded the exact dosages of animal tranquilizers, heavy sedatives, and experimental antibiotics he had intravenously administered to his captives, treating human beings entirely as disposable test subjects in his own deranged medical trials. Alongside these horrifying written accounts, investigators secured an archive of over 200 deeply disturbing Polaroid photographs that explicitly documented the agonizing, prolonged suffering of 6 specific young men who had previously vanished from the Kansas City streets. These instant photographs provided an irrefutable, chronological visual record of the physical degradation each victim endured over captivity periods that sometimes stretched for an agonizing 6 weeks before their inevitable murders. The investigation was further complicated and deeply traumatized by the forensic realization that Berdella had utilized his advanced knowledge of human anatomy and butchery to systematically dismember the deceased, carefully placing their remains into municipal garbage bags that were routinely collected by unsuspecting city sanitation workers. To build an airtight prosecutorial case, detectives were forced to painstakingly cross-reference the brutal handwritten logs with the recovered Polaroid images, establishing a definitive timeline of kidnapping, torture, and death for victims like Jerry Howell, Robert Sheldon, Mark Wallace, James Ferris, Todd Stoops, and Larry Pearson. The excavation of Berdella's backyard yielded even more grim evidence, as forensic anthropologists carefully unearthed 2 buried human skulls, finally providing shattered, grieving families with the definitive, heartbreaking confirmation of their loved ones' ultimate fates. Every new page read from the journals, and every photograph cataloged by the crime scene technicians further solidified the horrifying reality that Berdella possessed absolutely no capacity for human empathy, functioning entirely as a methodical, predatory archivist of extreme human agony. The climactic zenith of the investigation materialized when Bob Berdella, faced with an absolute mountain of uncompromising physical, photographic, and heavily documented evidence, was formally dragged into a Kansas City interrogation room to answer for his years of undocumented atrocities. Initially attempting to project his standard demeanor of a harmless, slightly eccentric local merchant who had simply been misunderstood, his fabricated fuckhead completely disintegrated the moment seasoned detectives systematically laid out the recovered Polaroid photographs across the metal interrogation table. The sheer, overwhelming volume of his own meticulous record, keeping effectively cornered him, as prosecutors realized they possessed an airtight, completely irrefutable narrative of his crimes written entirely in his own distinct handwriting. In a shocking, highly calculated legal maneuver designed exclusively to avoid the looming threat of the Missouri death penalty, Berdella abruptly abandoned all pretenses of innocence and offered a comprehensive, chillingly dispassionate confession to the murders of the 6 young men. During these extensive debriefing sessions, he spoke with the cold, detached cadence of a clinical researcher presenting a scientific paper, detailing his specific methods of capturing, sedating, and dismantling his victims without demonstrating a single ounce of genuine remorse or emotional distress. He calmly explained to the deeply unsettled investigators how he viewed his captives not as autonomous human beings, but as completely subservient property destined to fulfill his darkest, most deeply repressed psychological fantasies of absolute control. The devastating revelation that he had successfully utilized the city's standard trash collection infrastructure to flawlessly dispose of multiple human bodies sent profound shockwaves of horror throughout the entire Kansas City metropolitan area, forcing residents to completely reevaluate their understanding of neighborhood security. This calculated confession represented the ultimate, horrifying confirmation of the facts laid out in his journals, transforming the abstract terror of a missing persons case into a highly detailed, legally binding admission of systematic, prolonged torture and premeditated homicide. for the seasoned detectives and prosecuting attorneys involved in the harrowing interrogations. Listening to the architect of this nightmare calmly dissect his own atrocities proved to be a profoundly scarring professional experience that fundamentally challenged their understanding of absolute evil. By freely surrendering his own life's work of horrific documentation to the authorities, Berdella inadvertently supplied the justice system with the exact, uncompromising blueprint required to permanently remove him from the very society he had so ruthlessly exploited. In December of 1988, Robert Berdella officially pleaded guilty to first-degree murder charges and was subsequently sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a legal resolution that permanently spared the victims' families the agonizing trauma of enduring a highly publicized, drawn-out criminal trial. The notorious house on Charlotte Street, forever stained by the unimaginable suffering that occurred within its fortified walls, was ultimately purchased by a local group and completely demolished in 1993, erasing the physical structure of his crimes from the Kansas City landscape, while the psychological scars remained deeply embedded in the community. Berdella's tenure within the Missouri Department of Corrections was remarkably short-lived, as he unexpectedly died of a massive heart attack in October 1992 at the age of 43, abruptly terminating his life sentence and leaving countless questions regarding his psychological motivations permanently unanswered. For the families of Jerry Howell, Robert Sheldon, Mark Wallace, James Ferris, Todd Stoops, and Larry Pearson, the agonizing reality that their loved ones' final days were strictly defined by the clinical, sadistic entries in a madman's diary remains a heavy, enduring burden of absolute grief. The exhaustive journals and horrifying polaroids recovered from the bizarre bazaar merchant fundamentally shifted how criminal psychologists analyze highly organized, methodical predators, proving that some killers are driven not merely by the act of murder, but by the obsessive, continuous administrative cataloging of their absolute power. His meticulously detailed records provided the forensic community with unprecedented, albeit deeply traumatizing, insight into the daily, structural logistics of maintaining a long-term captivity scenario within a densely populated urban environment. Today, the vacant lot where the house once stood serves as a silent, heavily stigmatized memorial to the marginalized young men who were systematically erased by a predator hiding comfortably behind the respectable facade of a neighborhood watch captain. Berdella's case ultimately stands as a terrifying testament to the fact that the most damning, incontrovertible evidence of a serial killer's atrocities is frequently generated and carefully preserved by the very hands that committed the violence. While the Kansas City butcher relied on deeply private handwritten logs and instant film to document his reign of terror from the dark confines of his basement, another highly organized predator operating just a few hours away was simultaneously building his own terrifying archive. This chilling realization brings us to the meticulously organized hit kits and deeply psychological trophies of a man who terrorized the neighboring state of Kansas for decades, hiding behind the pristine facade of a suburban family man and church leader while demanding the world recognize his self-appointed moniker. Throughout the heartland of the American Midwest in the 1970s, the sprawling city of Wichita, Kansas projected an image of robust, industrious safety, serving as a haven for tight, knit communities and hardworking families seeking the traditional American dream. Operating seamlessly within this environment of absolute trust was Dennis Rader, a man who meticulously cultivated a flawless public facade as a dedicated family man, a reliable ADT security systems installer, a respected Cub Scout leader, and an active compliance officer for the local government. This extreme, carefully engineered normalcy allowed him to move invisibly through the suburban streets, granting him unfettered access to the private residences and security vulnerabilities of the very citizens who trusted his professional authority. Beneath this remarkably ordinary exterior, Rader harbored a deeply pathological, decades-long fantasy world heavily fueled by violent bondage magazines and a profound, insatiable desire to exert absolute physical and psychological control over vulnerable human lives. He spent countless hours in the privacy of his home, meticulously planning his future atrocities, referring to his human targets with chilling detachment as projects, while preparing highly detailed hit kits filled with pre-cut ropes, heavy tape, and various weapons. Among the residents living an ordinary, routine existence in this community were the members of the Oduro family, who represented the quintessential, unsuspecting targets perfectly situated within Raiders' geographic hunting ground. Joseph and Julie Otero, alongside their energetic children, found deep comfort in the predictable rhythms of their neighborhood, completely unaware that an organized predator was systematically surveilling their daily movements from the shadows. Their baseline of domestic security was an inherent, tragic illusion, easily pierced by a man who actively utilized his specialized insider knowledge of residential alarm systems to silently bypass their physical defenses. Raider dedicated months to quietly observing their routines, meticulously documenting their schedules, and psychologically preparing himself to cross the absolute boundary from dark, private fantasy into catastrophic physical reality. This calculated period of patient observation perfectly set the stage for a brutal awakening in Wichita. As a seemingly harmless neighbor, prepared to unleash a wave of documented terror that would permanently shatter the innocence of the entire region. The fragile illusion of absolute safety in Wichita was violently dismantled on the freezing morning of January 15, 1974, when Dennis Rader breached the Otero family home and successfully initiated his first documented, catastrophic slaughter. Armed with his carefully curated hit kit, he systematically overpowered and incapacitated Joseph Julie and two of their young children, Josephine and Joseph Jinger, utilizing calculated deceit to bind and subsequently strangle them in a horrifying display of absolute dominance. The deeply traumatic discovery of the brutalized crime scene by the surviving older Otero children when they returned from school served as the definitive, tragic point of no return for the entire city, instantly plunging the community into an era of unprecedented, suffocating paranoia. Driven by an overwhelming, narcissistic need to ensure his distinct brand of terror was properly recognized by the authorities and the public, Rader drafted a chilling, taunting communication detailing the precise mechanics of the murders. He explicitly directed local police to the letter's hidden location within an engineering textbook at the Wichita Public Library in October of that same year, marking the official commencement of his psychological warfare against law enforcement. In this foundational document, he forcefully claimed direct responsibility for the Arrow massacre and arrogantly assigned himself the moniker BTK, an acronym specifically standing for Bind, Torture, Kill, thereby establishing his permanent, terrifying brand in the public consciousness. This initial, highly calculated communication completely transformed the homicide investigation from a localized family tragedy into an urgent, desperate hunt for an organized, highly communicative serial killer who actively sought a symbiotic, taunting relationship with the local media. The letter definitively proved to investigators that the perpetrator was not a disorganized, passing transient, but rather a methodical, deeply entrenched resident who actively thrived on observing the widespread psychological torment of the entire metropolitan area. By officially naming himself and explicitly outlining his deeply disturbed, heavily regimented methodology, Rader laid the psychological groundwork for a decades-long cat-and-mouse game, proving his compulsion to document and broadcast his atrocities was just as strong as his urge to commit physical violence. This arrogant declaration effectively paralyzed the city of Wichita, forcing terrified residents to heavily fortify their homes, purchase firearms, and fundamentally distrust their neighbors while a merciless predator hid in plain sight behind a veneer of mundane suburban respectability. Over the subsequent 3 decades, Rader continued his sporadic but highly calculated reign of terror, claiming the lives of 6 more victims, while obsessively building a secret, heavily fortified archive of his atrocities, hidden directly beneath the floorboards of his family home. His predatory methodology evolved significantly to include the extensive stalking of single women, such as Catherine Bright, Shirley Vaughn, and Nancy Fox, whom he targeted with terrifying precision after weeks of covert surveillance. Rader frequently utilized his official position as a municipal compliance officer to casually roam various neighborhoods, memorize daily routines, and identify the most vulnerable entry points of residences without ever arousing the suspicion of passing patrol units. Following each brutal murder, he meticulously collected highly personal physical trophies, including the victim's driver's licenses, unique jewelry, and intimate clothing, which he used to continually fuel his psychological fantasies, long after the physical violence had concluded. Most disturbingly, Rader maintained an extensive, highly secretive photographic record of his crimes, utilizing instant polaroid cameras to capture deeply unsettling images of himself wearing the victim's clothing and bound in the exact contorted positions he had forced upon them. These autoerotic, meticulously staged photographs allowed him to effectively recreate the exact psychological dynamics of the crime scenes for his own private, continuous consumption, solidifying his role as both the architect and the obsessive archivist of his own terror. The Wichita Police Department, working alongside elite federal profilers, exhaustively chased thousands of false leads, interviewed countless potential suspects, and established massive, heavily funded task forces, yet they remained consistently thwarted by Rader's highly disciplined ability to compartmentalize his violent urges. The sprawling investigation eventually went completely cold during the quiet years of the 1990s, as Rader seemingly ceased his physical attacks, leading frustrated investigators to theorize that the elusive BTK killer had either died, been incarcerated for an unrelated crime, or simply aged out of his violent compulsions. However, the high-profile publication of an investigative book marking the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders in 2004 violently reignited Rader's pathological narcissism, prompting him to abruptly resume communication with the media to ensure his terrifying legacy was not eclipsed by time. He immediately began dropping meticulously packaged, puzzle-filled envelopes throughout the city, utilizing empty cereal boxes and heavily taped packages left in public parks to deliver authentic crime scene photographs and cryptic word searches that arrogantly mocked the police department's ongoing inability to identify him. This renewed, highly aggressive correspondence escalated the tension in Wichita to an absolute fever pitch, as detectives desperately analyzed every microscopic detail of the communications, recognizing that the killer's escalating arrogance and technological ignorance might finally provide the crucial opening they needed. The ultimate, catastrophic downfall of the BTK killer was not the result of brilliant forensic deduction at a bloody crime scene, but rather a direct, fatal consequence of his own staggering technological hubris and a brilliantly executed investigative deception by law enforcement. In early 2005, driven by an insatiable, obsessive need to streamline his communications and establish a more direct dialogue with the authorities, Rader submitted a printed message explicitly asking the police if a standard floppy disk could be digitally traced back to a specific computer. He arrogantly demanded that the police department respond to his technical inquiry via a cryptic classified advertisement placed in the local Wichita newspaper, believing he was dictating the terms of their engagement from an untouchable position of superiority. Understanding they had a singular, unprecedented opportunity to outsmart the arrogant predator, the police department strategically placed the requested advertisement, falsely assuring the killer that floppy disks were entirely secure, anonymous, and untraceable by modern investigative methods. Taking the investigative bait with astonishing, almost unbelievable naivete, Rader confidently mailed a purple 1.44 megabit floppy disk to a local Wichita television station, completely unaware that digital forensic experts would immediately extract the hidden metadata embedded deep within the disk's deleted files. The digital forensics team quickly recovered a deleted Microsoft Word document that contained the first name, Dennis, and explicitly identified the software's registration location of the Christ Lutheran Church, providing investigators with the exact geographical and personal coordinates required to shatter a 30-year mystery. Detectives rapidly cross-referenced this groundbreaking digital footprint with the church's leadership directory, successfully identifying the congregation's president, Dennis Rader, whose physical address, occupational history, and general physical description perfectly aligned with the extensive geographical profiling of the BTK investigation. To secure irrefutable biological proof before making a high, Stakes arrest on such a prominent community figure. Law enforcement obtained a highly classified secret subpoena for a routine medical tissue sample, previously provided by Rader's daughter at a university medical clinic. The subsequent laboratory analysis yielded a definitive, undeniable familial DNA match to the preserved biological evidence recovered from the historic BTK crime scenes, providing prosecutors with the absolute scientific certainty required to mobilize a heavily armed apprehension team. On February 25, 2005, a tactical unit abruptly surrounded Rader's vehicle during a seemingly routine drive to his home, permanently terminating his reign of terror without a single shot being fired and dragging the most notorious phantom in Kansas history directly into the harsh light of justice. During the subsequent marathon interrogation, Rader, completely stripped of his anonymity and confronted with the overwhelming digital and biological evidence, casually surrendered his BTK persona and spent hours dispassionately detailing every single murder with the clinical detachment of an office manager reviewing a quarterly report. The judicial proceedings surrounding Dennis Rader effectively bypassed a drawn-out, agonizing trial when he unexpectedly pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder in June 2005, fully acknowledging his decades of carefully documented atrocities in front of a stunned courtroom. Standing before the judge, he delivered a chillingly monotonous, incredibly detailed matter-of-fact monologue regarding the specific mechanics of his murders, completely devoid of any human empathy or genuine remorse for the catastrophic pain he had inflicted. He was officially sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, as the state of Kansas did not actively utilize the death penalty during the specific years he committed his murders, ensuring he would spend the absolute remainder of his natural life behind bars. Rader was subsequently transferred to the maximum security confines of the El Dorado Correctional Facility, where he was placed in strict solitary confinement to prevent him from acquiring the notoriety and attention he so desperately craved among the general prison population. The horrific public revelation of his dual identity completely devastated his unsuspecting wife and 2 children, who had lived for decades in the very home where he hid his twisted trophies, forcing them to grapple with the profound, inescapable trauma of their patriarch's monstrous deception. For the grieving families of the 10 victims, his definitive capture and subsequent sentencing provided a necessary, undeniable conclusion to a multi-generational nightmare, permanently removing the suffocating cloud of fear that had hovered heavily over the city of Wichita for 31 agonizing years. Today, Rader remains heavily isolated within his concrete cell, completely stripped of the absolute control and the terrifying power he once wielded over the community, his legacy entirely reduced to a pathetic cautionary tale of extreme technological ignorance. The vast BTK archive, containing his meticulously organized hit kits, chilling self-portraits, and the fatal purple floppy disk, now resides entirely within the secure, classified vaults of law enforcement, serving as vital educational material for behavioral analysts. His unprecedented case fundamentally revolutionized the global application of digital forensics in cold case investigations, definitively proving that even the most disciplined, elusive killers can be unmasked by the invisible data trails they unwittingly leave behind in their pursuit of infamy. While Rader heavily relied on complex bondage fantasies and a meticulous bureaucratic mindset to plan his physical attacks over several decades, another highly organized predator operating in an earlier era applied a much more direct, visual approach to capturing the absolute terror of his victims. Disturbing evolution of utilizing specialized equipment to physically trap and permanently document human suffering leads us directly to the lonely highways of 1950s California, where a seemingly timid camera enthusiast transformed his photographic hobby into a lethal instrument of psychological and physical subjugation. The post-war landscape of Los Angeles in the late 1950s was a beacon of glittering opportunity, drawing countless young women from across the country with the irresistible promise of Hollywood stardom and glamorous modeling careers. The vibrant, bustling streets of Southern California were filled with aspiring actresses and pin-up hopefuls who navigated a highly competitive, unregulated industry where freelance photo shoots were a standard, accepted stepping stone to professional success. It was an era characterized by a profound sense of trusting optimism, where the boundaries between legitimate talent scouting and predatory exploitation were dangerously blurred by the sheer volume of individuals desperately seeking their big break. Operating completely unnoticed within this radiant landscape of ambition was Harvey Glatman, an intensely socially awkward, unremarkable television repairman whose diminutive stature and protruding ears made him practically invisible to the glamorous women he secretly obsessed over. Glatman was a deeply disturbed individual with a heavily documented history of deviance, having previously served time in prison for a series of violent muggings before relocating to Los Angeles to blend seamlessly into the sprawling urban environment. To the outside world, he presented the pitiful, entirely non-threatening persona of a lonely, timid man who lacked the fundamental social skills necessary to maintain basic human relationships or attract romantic partners. Beneath this pathetic exterior, however, Glatman harbored a violent, deeply ingrained misogyny fueled by endless rejections and a pathological desire to exert absolute physical dominance over the beautiful women who routinely ignored his existence. Among the countless ambitious young women navigating the local freelance circuit was 19-year-old Judy Dole, a recently separated mother who actively sought modeling assignments to secure financial independence and build a better life for her infant child. Judy represented the quintessential, hardworking dreamer of the era, possessing a bright, photogenic appeal and a trusting nature that made her incredibly vulnerable to individuals who knew exactly how to manipulate the desperate hunger for professional exposure. Her daily existence revolved around a mundane but hopeful routine of contacting local photography studios, submitting her portfolio, and anxiously waiting for the singular opportunity that might finally launch her career, remaining blissfully unaware of the absolute darkness, quietly stalking the periphery of her chosen profession. The tragic intersection of Judy Dole's hopeful ambitions and Harvey Glatman's deeply premeditated malice occurred in August 1957, fundamentally altering the trajectory of the Los Angeles modeling community and triggering a horrifying sequence of documented atrocities. Utilizing the pseudonym Johnny Farrell, Glatman successfully contacted Judy and offered her a lucrative, immediate assignment for a purportedly legitimate pulp fiction magazine, capitalizing perfectly on her desperate need for income and professional visibility. When Judy arrived at Glatman's dimly lit apartment for what she believed would be a standard, theatrical photo shoot involving dramatic bondage poses common to the specific genre of the proposed magazine, she stepped completely unprotected into a meticulously orchestrated trap. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from a professional, albeit unusual, working environment into a suffocating nightmare the moment Glatman suddenly produced a loaded revolver, fundamentally shattering the illusion of the artistic endeavor. Realizing with absolute, paralyzing clarity that she was no longer a paid model but a captive victim, Judy was forcefully bound with heavy rope, gagged, and completely subjected to the erratic, terrifying whims of a man who drew immense psychological power from her profound helplessness. It was in this exact, agonizing moment of peak vulnerability that Glatman lifted his camera, not to capture a staged, theatrical scene for a fictional publication, but to permanently freeze the genuine, unfiltered terror radiating from his captive's eyes. The blinding flash of the camera bulb violently illuminated her suffering, transforming her desperate fight for survival into a permanent, physical trophy that the killer could meticulously preserve and endlessly consume long after the horrific event concluded. This calculated decision to photograph her profound distress marked the definitive point of no return for Glatman, completing his terrifying metamorphosis from a socially invisible, pathetic voyeur into an active, highly organized predator who required visual documentation to validate his violence. After subjecting Judy to unspeakable assaults, he drove her into the desolate, unforgiving expanse of the Mojave Desert, where he brutally strangled her and buried her remains in a shallow grave, leaving her family desperate for answers. The successful execution and documentation of this initial crime permanently unlocked Glatman's darkest compulsions, establishing a chilling, highly effective operational blueprint that he would immediately begin utilizing to ensnare other trusting women who were simply looking for a way to survive in the city. Emboldened by his absolute success in evading immediate detection and armed with his terrifying new methodology, Glatman rapidly escalated his predatory campaign throughout 1958, casting a wider net to identify vulnerable women who lacked immediate familial protection. He strategically shifted his hunting grounds to the popular, lonely hearts clubs of the era, exploiting the deep emotional isolation of young women who were actively seeking companionship and marriage in a sprawling, highly transient metropolis. Through these heavily utilized social networks, he meticulously identified and isolated 24-year-old Shirley Bridgeford, smoothly charming her with the promise of a romantic date, before brutally abducting her, subjecting her to his horrific photographic rituals, and abandoning her lifeless body in the sprawling desert landscape. Just months later, he reverted to his original, highly effective ruse of posing as a professional photographer to lure 23-year-old Ruth Mercado, a beautiful, aspiring model whom he bound, assaulted, and photographed extensively over a terrifying 3-day captivity before ultimately murdering her in the exact same desolate region. The police investigations into these sudden, highly unusual disappearances were severely hampered by the inherently transient nature of the victims, the massive geographical vastness of the Mojave Desert, and the complete absence of any physical crime scenes within the city limits of Los Angeles. Law enforcement agencies initially struggled to connect the missing women, as Glatman had operated with a terrifyingly disciplined compartmentalization, ensuring that his public life as a quiet, unassuming television repairman remained entirely separate from his secret, brutal excursions into the wilderness. While detectives desperately chased dead-end leads and interviewed countless associates of the victims, Glatman sat comfortably in his apartment, obsessively reviewing his expanding, hidden archive of bound portraits, completely consumed by the permanent visual record of his absolute dominance. The sheer impunity with which he operated severely inflated his confidence, leading him to believe that his meticulously crafted traps and his carefully selected hunting grounds were entirely immune to the traditional investigative methods employed by local law enforcement. Every time he successfully lured a new victim, bound them with his specialized knots, and immortalized their terror with his camera flash, the psychological stakes of his lethal game increased, pushing him inevitably toward a fatal miscalculation fueled by his own arrogant predictability. The catastrophic collapse of Harvey Glatman's meticulously documented reign of terror did not originate from a brilliant forensic breakthrough or a prolonged police stakeout, but rather from the extraordinary, sheer willpower of a young woman named Lorraine Vigil in October 1958. Lorraine, who had recently accepted an offer from Glatman for a seemingly legitimate photography gig, found herself riding in his vehicle toward what she believed was a scenic location, entirely unaware that she was seated next to one of the most prolific killers in California. As Glatman abruptly veered off the main highway and drove the vehicle down a secluded, unpaved dirt road into a remote, heavily brushed area, Lorraine's internal alarms immediately triggered, recognizing the devastating shift in his demeanor and the sheer isolation of their surroundings. When he abruptly stopped the car, produced his loaded revolver, and aggressively attempted to force her into submission, expecting the same paralyzing fear he had successfully elicited from his previous victims, Lorraine fundamentally shattered his operational blueprint by fighting back with unimaginable ferocity. Refusing to become another bound subject in his horrific photographic archive, she violently engaged the armed predator in a desperate, close-quarters physical struggle within the confined space of the vehicle, biting, scratching, and screaming for her absolute survival. In a shocking, chaotic turn of events, Lorraine miraculously managed to wrestle the heavy firearm directly out of Glatman's grip, completely turning the tables on the stunned, physically outmatched killer who had relied entirely on the threat of the weapon to enforce his dominance. Armed with his own gun, she forcefully held the terrified predator at bay, keeping him pinned down on the desolate roadside, until a highly observant highway patrol officer, noticing the erratic vehicle and the violent commotion, immediately intervened and secured the scene. This sudden, Explosive confrontation instantly neutralized the Lonely Hearts Killer, stripping away his arrogant facade of absolute control and delivering a severely battered, publicly humiliated Harvey Glattman directly into the uncompromising hands of the California justice system. Following his dramatic, violent apprehension on the side of the highway, investigators swiftly executed a comprehensive search warrant at Glattman's Los Angeles apartment, seeking tangible evidence to connect the failed kidnapping to the string of unsolved disappearances. Hidden securely within a heavy, locked toolbox in his residence, detectives uncovered the absolute, undeniable proof of his atrocities: a meticulously preserved, horrifying collection of photographs explicitly detailing the bound, terrified final moments of Judy Dole, Shirley Bridgeford, and Ruth Mercado. Faced with the overwhelming, insurmountable weight of his own meticulously generated visual evidence, Glattman completely abandoned any legal defense, freely and dispassionately confessing to the 3 brutal murders and explicitly guiding law enforcement to the exact desert locations where he had buried their remains. The subsequent legal proceedings were remarkably swift, as the photographic archive provided prosecutors with a chillingly flawless, completely irrefutable narrative of premeditated, aggravated murder, leaving absolutely no room for judicial leniency or prolonged appellate delays. Harvey Glattman was found entirely guilty of his horrific crimes and was subsequently executed in the lethal gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison in September 1959, just 11 months after his catastrophic encounter with Lorraine Vigil. The devastating legacy of his photographic compulsion fundamentally altered how law enforcement profiled sexually motivated predators, definitively proving that the camera could be weaponized as an instrument of absolute psychological torture, just as effectively as a firearm. The grieving families of the victims were left to grapple with the agonizing reality that the terror inflicted upon their loved ones had been permanently captured on film, a dark archive that remains locked away in police vaults as a testament to human depravity. While Glattman utilized the cumbersome, mechanical technology of the 1950s to privately hoard his physical photographs in a locked toolbox, the relentless evolution of communication would eventually allow modern predators to broadcast their visual records of violence instantly to a global audience. This terrifying technological shift leads us directly from the dusty, isolated deserts of mid-century California to the hyper-connected, digital landscape of the 21st century, where a deeply disturbed young woman utilized her smartphone to instantly share her freshly committed atrocity with the entire world on social media. The sweeping integration of social media into daily life has created an unprecedented reality where human beings routinely broadcast their most intimate moments, fundamentally altering how society processes everything from joyous celebrations to profound, devastating grief. Within the quiet, deeply traditional Appalachian communities of Montgomery County, Virginia, 24-year-old Amanda Taylor navigated her existence alongside her husband, Rex Taylor, attempting to build a stable life amidst the beautiful, rolling hills of the rural South. For years, the young couple presented a reasonably ordinary facade to their surrounding community, blending seamlessly into the quiet rhythm of the region, while privately battling severe, escalating issues with substance abuse and deepening psychological instability. Their shared dependency created a highly toxic, codependent environment that ultimately culminated in an absolute, devastating tragedy when Rex committed suicide by hanging in August of 2014, fundamentally shattering Amanda's already fragile grip on reality. Instead of seeking traditional psychological support or relying on the comforting embrace of her local community to navigate this profound loss, Amanda retreated entirely into the darkest, most unregulated corners of the internet. She rapidly became completely consumed by the macabre, immersing herself deeply in online communities on platforms like Tumblr that romanticized violence, actively glorified notorious serial killers, and treated genuine human suffering as a twisted form of digital entertainment. This relentless, daily exposure to online gore and true crime idolization severely warped her grieving process, transforming her profound, agonizing sorrow into a highly volatile, misdirected rage that desperately sought a physical target to hold accountable for her husband's death. To her neighbors and remaining family members, she was simply a grieving, troubled widow who needed space and time to heal, entirely unaware that her digital diet was actively rewiring her psychological framework to justify extreme violence. The deep contrast between the peaceful, isolated mountains of Virginia and the boundless, terrifying echo chambers of the internet created a perfect, isolated incubation chamber for her absolute radicalization. She spent countless hours curating her online persona, signaling her dark descent to thousands of anonymous followers who passively consumed her increasingly disturbing posts without ever realizing that her digital threats were rapidly crystallizing into a highly premeditated, lethal reality. The definitive point of no return for Amanda Taylor materialized when her amorphous, generalized anger regarding Rex's tragic suicide sharply narrowed and focused entirely on her father-in-law, 59-year-old Charles Taylor. Amanda developed a rigid, completely unshakable delusion that Charles was fundamentally responsible for his son's death, blaming the older man for allegedly introducing Rex to illicit narcotics years prior and failing to provide the emotional support she believed would have prevented the suicide. This heavily fixated, absolute hatred completely consumed her daily thoughts, transitioning her online aesthetic of passive, dark melancholy directly into an active, highly targeted homicidal ideation that required a physical manifestation to satisfy her craving for vengeance. Recognizing that she needed an accomplice to successfully execute her violent fantasy and navigate the subsequent aftermath, Amanda deliberately manipulated a longtime acquaintance named Sean Ball, exploiting his deeply ingrained, unrequited romantic feelings for her. Ball, a seemingly ordinary individual who lacked a significant criminal history, became entirely mesmerized by Amanda's intense, commanding personality, willingly blinding himself to the absolute insanity of her rapidly forming murder plot in a desperate bid to secure her affection. Amanda utilized her smartphone not just as a tool for consuming dark content, but as an active organizational instrument, sending encrypted messages and coordinating the specific logistical details of their impending attack on the unsuspecting Charles Taylor. The inciting anomaly that shifted this situation from a disturbed woman's online venting to a catastrophic physical emergency was the definitive, terrifying moment when Amanda and Sean actively procured a large, fixed blade hunting knife and mapped out their route to Charles's residence. This calculated acquisition of a lethal weapon and the establishment of a concrete timeline completely shattered the barrier between digital roleplay and physical, premeditated murder, setting a lethal sequence of events into irreversible motion. Charles Taylor, living quietly in his rural home, remained entirely oblivious to the fact that his own daughter-in-law had successfully weaponized her grief, manipulated a willing accomplice, and was actively traveling toward his front door with the absolute intention of ending his life. The quiet, trusting nature of the familial relationship was about to be brutally exploited, weaponized by a mind that had entirely detached from the moral constraints of the physical world and aligned itself completely with the sociopathic logic of her online echo chambers. On the afternoon of April 4, 2015, the carefully orchestrated nightmare breached the threshold of Charles Taylor's reality when Amanda and Sean arrived at his Montgomery County home under the guise of a routine, seemingly harmless family visit. As Charles comfortably sat on his living room sofa, completely disarmed by the presence of individuals he inherently trusted, Amanda violently initiated the premeditated attack, repeatedly plunging the heavy hunting knife into her father-in-law with an absolutely terrifying, unrelenting ferocity. While Sean Ball assisted in incapacitating the severely wounded man, Amanda ensured the brutal execution was carried out to its absolute, lethal conclusion, acting out the violent fantasies she had obsessively consumed and glorified on the internet for months. The true, unprecedented horror of this crime unfolded immediately following the cessation of physical violence, when Amanda, covered entirely in her victim's blood, calmly retrieved her smartphone and snapped a chilling photograph of the murder weapon resting beside Charles's lifeless body. Without a single ounce of hesitation or genuine human remorse, she instantly uploaded this graphic, undeniable visual evidence of her atrocity directly to her public Instagram account, boldly declaring to her followers that she had successfully avenged her husband's death. This staggering, instant broadcast of a bloody homicide fundamentally transformed the traditional timeline of a murder investigation, instantly alerting the digital world, and subsequently local law enforcement, to the absolute reality of the crime before the physical body had even begun to cool. Following the upload, Amanda and Sean fled the immediate crime scene, initiating a chaotic, highly erratic, multi-state manhunt that was continuously fueled and publicly documented by Amanda's own incessant, boastful updates across various social media platforms. As detectives frantically secured the bloody living room in Virginia and initiated a massive regional dragnet, they were forced into the surreal, unprecedented position of actively monitoring a fugitive's social media feeds to glean critical geographical clues and assess her rapidly escalating psychological state. Amanda's online followers, initially believing the graphic photograph was a sophisticated practical joke or an elaborate piece of dark art, were quickly confronted with the horrifying realization that they had just witnessed the real-time, digital confession of an active, highly dangerous murderer. The fugitives utilized the stolen money from the victim to purchase firearms and ammunition in North Carolina, preparing for what Amanda heavily implied online would be a spectacular, violent confrontation with authorities, continuously utilizing her glowing screen to taunt the police and demand the infamy she so desperately craved. The intense, heavily documented manhunt reached its absolute, catastrophic peak of tension, not through a dramatic shootout with pursuing law enforcement, but through a sudden, violent internal betrayal that highlighted Amanda's complete detachment from human loyalty. As the pair drove aimlessly through the rural expanses of North Carolina, the overwhelming reality of their horrific actions and the massive, inescapable law enforcement net closing in around them began to severely fracture Sean Ball's psychological resolve. Recognizing his deepening hesitation and correctly perceiving his growing panic as a direct, imminent threat to her own freedom and her carefully constructed narrative of remorseless vengeance, Amanda coldly decided to entirely eliminate her sole accomplice. In a desolate, wooded area near the Blue Ridge Parkway, Amanda casually drew one of their newly acquired firearms and ruthlessly shot Sean Ball directly in the face, leaving him bleeding profusely on the side of the road while she stole his vehicle and continued her flight alone. Miraculously, Ball survived this devastating, point-blank execution attempt, managing to drag himself to a nearby hospital where he immediately provided pursuing authorities with Amanda's exact, updated vehicle description and her last known geographical heading. This critical, bloody intelligence allowed federal and state authorities to drastically narrow their search parameters, rapidly converging on her position while she continued to obsessively check her social media notifications, entirely unaware that her digital vanity was severely compromising her physical evasion tactics. The climactic apprehension occurred entirely without the cinematic, blazing shootout Amanda had promised her online followers, as heavily armed tactical units seamlessly surrounded her stolen vehicle at a routine traffic intersection in North Carolina, effectively trapping the self-proclaimed killer. Confronted by an overwhelming show of absolute, uncompromising force and completely stripped of any tactical advantage, Amanda surrendered to the authorities without offering any physical resistance, her terrifying digital bravado instantly evaporating in the harsh, undeniable presence of state police rifles. The capture brought an immediate, decisive halt to her highly publicized, chaotic reign of terror, pulling her forcefully out of the boundless, unregulated digital realm, where she felt invincible, and dragging her directly into the rigid, inescapable confines of a concrete holding cell. Her arrest permanently severed her connection to the virtual audience she had so violently sought to impress, leaving law enforcement with the unprecedented task of prosecuting a killer who had already provided a flawless, globally broadcasted visual confession of her absolute guilt. The subsequent legal proceedings against Amanda Taylor were remarkably straightforward, completely devoid of the traditional courtroom suspense, primarily due to the overwhelming, absolutely irrefutable digital evidence she had arrogantly provided to the global public. During her highly publicized trial in Virginia, Amanda displayed a profound, deeply disturbing lack of remorse, frequently smiling at the cameras, openly maintaining that she felt completely justified in her actions, and expressing zero regret for permanently destroying her father-in-law's life. Faced with her own explicit social media confessions, the graphic Instagram photograph, and the cooperating testimony of the heavily scarred Sean Ball, the jury swiftly convicted her of first-degree murder, completely rejecting any assertions of temporary insanity or profound psychological distress. She was rightfully sentenced to life in prison, ensuring she would spend the absolute remainder of her natural existence entirely isolated from the digital platforms and the toxic online communities that had actively nurtured and glorified her violent descent. Sean Ball, recognizing his own catastrophic complicity in the nightmare, eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder for his role in the brutal attack and received a lengthy prison sentence, permanently bearing the physical and psychological scars of his devastating intersection with Amanda's calculated madness. The horrifying legacy of the Amanda Taylor case continues to serve as a stark, modern warning regarding the profound dangers of unregulated internet echo chambers and the terrifying reality that social media can instantly transform private, deeply disturbed ideations into globally broadcasted atrocities. Her desperate, violent quest for digital infamy fundamentally proved that modern technology allows perpetrators to construct and distribute their own terrifying archives in real time, completely bypassing the private, hidden collections utilized by the killers of previous generations. While Amanda utilized a smartphone to instantly broadcast her raw, unfiltered violence to the world, another individual sought to meticulously blend his homicidal compulsions with the structured, highly produced narrative of an independent film production. This deeply disturbing intersection of violent reality, cinematic ambition, and obsessive documentation leads us directly to the cold suburbs of Canada, where an aspiring director transformed his seemingly fictional movie script into a terrifyingly accurate, heavily detailed blueprint for absolute, premeditated murder. The sprawling, industrious city of Edmonton, Alberta, presented a landscape where modern technological convenience increasingly intersected with the universal, deeply human desire for romantic connection during the mid-2000s. Within this bustling Canadian metropolis, 38-year-old Johnny Altinger navigated his daily routine as an IT professional and dedicated worker at an oilfield equipment manufacturing plant, representing the quintessential, hard-working individual seeking companionship in the digital age. Altinger was widely known among his tight-knit circle of friends as a profoundly gentle, trusting, and fiercely loyal man whose primary focus outside of his professional obligations was finding a meaningful, long-term relationship. Like millions of other hopeful singles during this era, he increasingly relied on popular online dating platforms, specifically navigating the digital profiles on Plenty of Fish, completely unaware that these virtual ecosystems could be effortlessly manipulated by highly organized predators. Operating within the exact same geographical boundaries was Mark Twitchell, an aspiring, intensely ambitious independent filmmaker who possessed a deeply ingrained, pathological obsession with popular true crime media and fictionalized serial killer narratives. Twitchell outwardly projected the persona of a creative, dedicated director determined to make his mark on the local arts scene, utilizing his cinematic aspirations as a seemingly legitimate cover for the construction of a highly disturbing, premeditated nightmare. Beneath his artistic facade, Twitchell was actively attempting to blur the rigid boundaries between cinematic fiction and brutal physical reality, drawing heavy, direct inspiration from the popular television show Dexter, which heavily romanticized the methodical, double life of a forensic technician who moonlighted as a vigilante serial killer. He utilized his knowledge of film production and set design not to create entertainment, but to meticulously engineer a functional, soundproofed kill room inside a rented residential garage situated in a quiet Edmonton neighborhood. This terrifying intersection of genuine, trusting vulnerability on the part of Johnny Altinger and the heavily calculated, cinematic delusions of Mark Twitchell created a perfect storm of modern predation, highlighting the extreme dangers lurking behind the anonymizing veil of digital profiles. The stage was effectively set for a catastrophic collision between an innocent man seeking love and a deeply disturbed narcissist who viewed human life entirely as disposable raw material for his ultimate, real-world horror production. The seemingly ordinary trajectory of Johnny Altinger's life was abruptly and permanently derailed on the evening of October 10, 2008, when he received a promising communication from a woman calling herself Jen on the Plenty of Fish dating platform. This fabricated digital entity, carefully constructed and flawlessly maintained by Twitchell, provided Altinger with specific, highly unusual directions for their first in-person meeting, instructing him to bypass traditional public venues and instead arrive directly at a specific residential garage tucked away in a quiet suburban alley. Despite harboring some inherent reservations about the deeply unorthodox nature of the meetup location, Altinger's trusting nature and genuine hope for a romantic connection fundamentally overpowered his initial skepticism, prompting him to drive to the specified address, while simultaneously forwarding the bizarre instructions to his close friends as a basic safety precaution. When he arrived at the dark, unassuming garage and was subsequently lured inside, the fragile illusion of a romantic digital encounter instantly shattered, transitioning immediately into a highly premeditated, brutally physical ambush orchestrated by a man dressed entirely in a specialized, protective kill suit. The definitive point of no return for the subsequent investigation was not the immediate discovery of a crime scene, but rather the highly suspicious, deeply uncharacteristic digital communications that Altinger's friends and family began receiving in the days following his absolute disappearance. They received bizarre, poorly written emails originating directly from Johnny's personal accounts, claiming he had suddenly met a remarkable woman named Jen and impulsively boarded a spontaneous flight to Costa Rica for an extended romantic vacation. Recognizing with absolute certainty that this wildly irresponsible behavior completely contradicted Johnny's heavily established, fiercely responsible personality and his dedicated commitment to his ongoing career, his friends immediately bypassed these digital smokescreens and contacted the Edmonton Police Service. This critical, deeply intuitive realization by his support network effectively transformed a seemingly voluntary adult absence into a highly urgent, high-stakes missing persons investigation, forcing law enforcement to look directly past the fabricated emails and examine the physical coordinates of the garage Johnny had forwarded right before he vanished. The sudden juxtaposition of a meticulously maintained, professional life with an abruptly announced, entirely unverified international vacation provided detectives with their very first, crucial thread in unraveling a highly organized, heavily documented criminal conspiracy. As Edmonton detectives initiated their preliminary investigation into the coordinates provided in Altinger's final messages, they physically converged on the rented residential garage, immediately encountering Mark Twitchell, who presented a highly polished, seemingly cooperative demeanor. Twitchell confidently explained to the responding officers that he was merely a local independent filmmaker utilizing the space as a primary set for an upcoming horror movie titled House of Cards, casually dismissing any knowledge of a missing man or a digital dating profile named Jen. During this initial, highly tense interaction, Twitchell actually allowed the detectives to perform a cursory visual inspection of the garage, fully relying on his arrogant assumption that his meticulous cleaning efforts with industrial chemicals had successfully eradicated any trace of the brutal violence that had occurred within those walls. However, the seasoned investigators immediately noticed deeply unsettling inconsistencies within his narrative, particularly the presence of an incredibly heavy, industrial-grade padlock that secured the garage from the inside, an architectural detail completely unnecessary for a standard film production, but absolutely critical for a secure captivity scenario. As the police intensified their scrutiny, applying mounting pressure through secondary interviews and extensive background checks, they discovered another vital, terrifying piece of the puzzle: a man named Gilles Tetrault, who bravely came forward to report that he had barely survived a nearly identical, violently aborted ambush at that exact same garage just 1 week prior to Altinger's disappearance. Tetrault's harrowing testimony provided investigators with an exact, operational blueprint of the predator's methodology, confirming that Twitchell was actively utilizing the promise of an online date to lure multiple men into his meticulously prepared, weaponized soundstage. Armed with this catastrophic new intelligence, law enforcement secured comprehensive, highly intrusive search warrants for both the rented garage and Twitchell's personal digital devices, initiating a massive forensic operation designed to shatter his cinematic alibi. When crime scene technicians deployed advanced chemical reagents within the seemingly pristine garage, the entire floor violently illuminated, revealing a massive, previously invisible blood-letting event that completely contradicted Twitchell's claims of utilizing synthetic theatrical blood for his film production. This undeniable, glowing forensic reality permanently transitioned the investigation from a desperate search for a missing man into a highly tactical, evidence-gathering mission focused entirely on dismantling the intricate web of lies constructed by a deeply disturbed, legally cornered narcissist. The escalating tension reached a fever pitch as digital forensic experts simultaneously breached the heavily encrypted hard drive of Twitchell's personal laptop. Desperately searching for the digital script he claimed to have written, entirely unaware that they were about to uncover the most terrifying, uncompromising document in Canadian true crime history, the absolute, staggering climax of the Edmonton Police Service's investigation materialized the moment digital forensic specialists managed to successfully recover a massively detailed, recently deleted Microsoft Word document from Mark Twitchell's personal laptop, chillingly titled SK Confessions. As investigators began to painstakingly read through this extensive, heavily dense text, they were instantly plunged into the darkest, most unfiltered recesses of a highly organized killer's mind, realizing with absolute horror that they were not reading a fictional screenplay, but a flawless, arrogant diary of premeditated murder. The document explicitly, step by step, detailed the author's overwhelming psychological transition from a civilian to a serial killer, meticulously chronicling the specific construction of the kill room, the procurement of specific dismemberment tools, and the failed, highly frustrating first attack on Jill's Tetrault. The narrative then shifted seamlessly into a cold, clinical, and completely remorseless account of the successful luring, physical incapacitation, brutal murder, and subsequent dismemberment of a man entirely matching Johnny Altinger's profile, explicitly confirming that the author had utilized a heavy metal pipe and a hunting knife to execute the victim. Twitchell arrogantly used this document to process his own twisted emotional state, heavily documenting his adrenaline rush, his physical exhaustion during the clean-up process, and his chilling decision to utilize the city's vast, subterranean sewer system to systematically dispose of Altinger's fragmented remains. Confronted within a secure interrogation room by the overwhelming, completely irrefutable weight of his own recovered, heavily detailed confession, Twitchell's carefully constructed cinematic facade completely disintegrated, leaving him legally cornered by his own obsessive, pathological need to privately document his ultimate triumph. The profound shock experienced by the seasoned detectives, who were forced to digest this document, was unprecedented, as they realized Twitchell had essentially written his own airtight prosecution, providing the Crown with the exact dates, methods, and psychological motivations required to secure a permanent conviction. His desperate, highly manipulative attempt during the trial to suddenly claim that the SK Confessions document was still just an elaborate, fictionalized piece of immersive research was completely destroyed by the undeniable physical recovery of Altinger's remains deep within the exact sewer lines detailed in the text. This recovery perfectly synchronized the digital diary, like confession, with absolute, undeniable physical reality, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that the aspiring filmmaker had completely crossed the line from a harmless, creative enthusiast into an active, highly dangerous butcher who required written validation of his atrocities. In April of 2011, following a heavily publicized and profoundly disturbing trial that forced the jury to directly confront the blurred lines between violent media consumption and real-world homicide, Mark Twitchell was definitively convicted of first-degree murder by the Canadian justice system. He was subsequently sentenced to life in prison with absolutely no possibility of parole for a minimum of 25 years, effectively removing a highly organized, heavily premeditated predator from the streets of Edmonton and permanently terminating his deeply twisted cinematic aspirations. The undeniable facts of the case remain heavily centered on the tragic, permanent loss of Johnny Altinger, an entirely innocent man who simply sought human connection, but was ruthlessly utilized as a disposable prop in a narcissist's private horror production. Currently incarcerated within the maximum security confines of the Saskatchewan Penitentiary, Twitchell reportedly continues to consume television and literature. Entirely isolated from the technological tools and the digital anonymity he previously weaponized to build his fatal traps. The SK Confessions document itself remains firmly locked within the secure vaults of the Judicial Archive, serving as a highly scrutinized, terrifying case study for behavioral analysts, examining the modern intersections of extreme narcissism, digital luring, and the pathological need for extensive, self-generated documentation. The absolute finality of his concrete cell stands in stark contrast to the vast, imaginary empire he attempted to build through his keyboard, heavily reinforcing the reality that even the most meticulously planned, digitally documented crimes leave a permanent, undeniable trail for determined investigators to follow. While Twitchell utilized the modern convenience of a personal laptop and a digital word processor to privately catalog his brutal transition into a killer, another highly methodical individual operating decades earlier relied on much older, analog equipment to build a massive, physical archive of horror. This terrifying divergence in the medium of preservation leads us directly into the deeply secretive, heavily restricted society of the Soviet Union, where a trusted authority figure exploited his esteemed position to systematically film and document his lethal, decades-long experiments on innocent youth. During the height of the Cold War, the heavily restricted, tightly monitored society of the Soviet Union fundamentally relied upon the absolute projection of ideological purity and the comforting illusion of perfect, state-sponsored security. Within this rigid geopolitical landscape, the industrial city of Nevinominsk functioned as a typical, industrious settlement where citizens deeply trusted the established authority figures and the institutions designed to shape the moral character of their youth. Operating at the very pinnacle of this localized societal trust was Anatoly Slivko, a highly decorated, profoundly respected member of the Communist Party, who proudly held the prestigious title of Honored Teacher of the Russian SFSR. Slivko managed a highly popular, state-funded youth organization known as the Churjid Mountain Club, an institution that successfully drew in countless young boys with the irresistible promise of outdoor adventures, wilderness survival training, and deeply romanticized pioneer camaraderie. For the struggling families and single mothers of the region, Slivko represented the absolute ideal of a masculine role model, a stern but deeply caring father figure who dedicated his life to instilling discipline, patriotism, and resilience in the local youth. The boys who eagerly attended his club sessions viewed him with an uncompromising reverence, completely willing to follow his complex instructions and blindly trusting his authority in the isolated mountainous terrains where they frequently camped. This absolute, unquestioning faith in his leadership created an environment of extreme, systemic vulnerability, masking the terrifying reality that the revered director was utilizing the state apparatus to meticulously construct a highly controlled hunting ground. Behind the facade of knot-tying exercises and campfire songs, Slivko harbored deeply pathological, violent compulsions that required the total physical subjugation of young, defenseless males to achieve any semblance of psychological satisfaction. The community's inherent belief that serial predation was an exclusive, degenerate byproduct of Western capitalism effectively blinded them to the monster operating in broad daylight within their own heavily fortified, socialist borders. The parents of Nevinominsk continuously handed their children over to the very architect of their impending destruction, entirely oblivious to the fact that the esteemed teacher viewed his eager pupils not as the future of the Soviet state, but as disposable subjects for his own horrific, documented experiments. The definitive catastrophic transition from strict wilderness mentorship into a highly organized, lethal predation strategy commenced when Slivko successfully introduced a heavily manufactured, deceptive narrative to his most vulnerable students regarding secret endurance testing. He began systematically isolating individual boys from the larger group during remote camping excursions, smoothly convincing them that they were specially selected to participate in classified, highly dangerous survival experiments required to become elite Soviet spies or actors in an underground partisan film. Utilizing his unshakable authority, Slivko instructed the trusting children to submit to various forms of extreme physical deprivation, which frequently involved being tightly bound and deliberately deprived of oxygen until they lost consciousness, under the absolute promise that he would safely revive them. The inciting anomaly that transformed these deeply abusive experiments into a permanent, documented nightmare was Slivko's calculated introduction of an 8mm analog film camera into the isolated forest clearings. He convinced the boys that the camera was necessary to officially record their bravery for the state, while in reality, it served as the absolute required medium for capturing their genuine terror and physical degradation for his own private, endless consumption. This mechanical eye fundamentally validated his sadism, capturing the agonizing moments of strangulation and the horrific, artificially induced unconsciousness that he would systematically inflict upon his victims over and over again. The point of no return for this esteemed teacher was crossed in 1964, when a session with a young boy named Kolya Dobryshev inevitably escalated beyond the twisted parameters of his revival game, resulting in the child's absolute, permanent asphyxiation. Instead of experiencing panic or remorse over the lethal outcome of his actions, Slivko discovered a profound, dark satisfaction in successfully capturing a genuine human death on analog film, effectively unlocking a catastrophic, decades-long compulsion. The horrific success of this initial, fully documented murder established a flawless operational blueprint that allowed him to seamlessly blend his homicidal urges with his professional duties, ensuring a continuous, unmonitored supply of victims. The camera was no longer merely a prop utilized for a deceptive narrative. It had become an indispensable, highly lethal instrument of his pathology, transforming the remote Soviet wilderness into a silent, heavily active production studio for unimaginable atrocities. Over the course of the next 2 decades, Anatoly Slivko operated with an absolutely terrifying level of impunity, utilizing his esteemed position at the Churchid Club to systematically abuse dozens of young boys and permanently extinguish the lives of at least 7 individuals. The local police force, the militia, continually failed to connect the deeply alarming string of local disappearances, heavily hampered by strict Soviet ideological doctrines that outright refused to acknowledge the very existence of organized serial killers within a communist utopian society. Whenever a boy vanished from the community, the authorities routinely dismissed the case as a simple runaway situation, utterly failing to investigate the glaring, common denominator that each missing child was an active, dedicated member of Slivko's mountain club. Meanwhile, hidden securely within the heavily locked back rooms of the state-funded Churchid facility, Slivko meticulously cultivated a massive, physically imposing archive of his undetected crimes, acting as a highly dedicated film editor for his own atrocities. He spent countless hours in the darkroom, obsessively splicing together the 80mm film reels, carefully indexing the footage of the boys' agonizing final moments, and maintaining detailed, handwritten journals that explicitly cataloged the specific physiological responses of his victims. Alongside this massive visual and written record, he curated a deeply morbid physical collection of the victims' footwear, cleaning and preserving the shoes as tangible, tactile trophies of the lives he had completely erased from the Soviet landscape. The sheer longevity of his undetected operational span allowed him to refine his methods to a terrifying degree, establishing a highly clinical, almost industrial approach to his private snuff film production while continuing to receive public accolades for his exceptional service to the state. However, the absolute veil of secrecy slowly began to fracture in the mid-1980s when a highly observant, deeply dedicated state investigator named Vladimir Kolesnikov finally recognized the undeniable, statistical impossibility of so many missing youth originating from a single, specific pioneer organization. Despite facing immense bureaucratic resistance from local party officials, who outright refused to investigate one of their most decorated members, Kolesnikov methodically gathered circumstantial evidence, slowly tightening the investigative net around the untouchable club director. The realization that a prominent community figure could be responsible for a multi-generational tragedy effectively shattered the localized illusion of security, setting the stage for an unprecedented, highly volatile raid that would expose the darkest secret in Soviet criminal history. The absolute, staggering climax of the investigation materialized in late December 1985, when law enforcement officials finally secured the unprecedented authorization to execute comprehensive search warrants at both Slivko's private residence and the heavily guarded premises of the Churchid Club. As investigators breached the locked, secretive inner sanctums of the state-funded facility, they were entirely unprepared for the sheer, overwhelming volume of physical and visual evidence that definitively exposed the esteemed director as a prolific, methodical butcher. Hidden seamlessly within the club's administrative storage, detectives uncovered 43 separate reels of meticulously labeled Epidemion film, alongside the extensive, handwritten diaries and the chilling, perfectly preserved collection of the young victim's shoes. The true horror of the discovery peaked when the hardened Soviet investigators were forced to actually project the recovered reels onto a screen, subjecting themselves to the agonizing, visual reality of a trusted teacher systematically torturing and murdering the children under his care. These silent, grainy snuff films stripped away any conceivable defense, providing an airtight, irrefutable, completely objective record of Slivko's premeditated atrocities, showcasing his clinical detachment as he actively performed for his own camera. Confronted in the interrogation room with the overwhelming, completely undeniable weight of his own extensive cinematography and the recovered physical trophies, Slivko's carefully maintained facade of righteous indignation completely collapsed, recognizing with absolute certainty that his obsessive, pathological need to document his power had provided the state with the exact, flawless blueprint of his entire criminal career. The disgraced teacher calmly offered a full, detailed confession. He meticulously explained his dark methodologies to the stunned detectives, detailing the specific locations where he had buried the remains of the 7 murdered boys over the span of 20 years, treating the interrogation as if he were simply recounting the logistical details of a film shoot. This definitive, highly documented unmasking of a revered Communist Party member sent profound shockwaves throughout the highest levels of the Soviet government, forcing the state to finally acknowledge the terrifying reality that absolute monsters could seamlessly integrate themselves into the very fabric of their society. The recovery of the film reels permanently checkmated the predator, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the most damning witness against Anatoly Slivko was his own, deeply cherished mechanical camera. The subsequent judicial proceedings against Anatoly Slivko were conducted with swift, uncompromising severity, completely devoid of the public spectacle typical of Western trials, as the Soviet state sought to rapidly excise the profound embarrassment of his existence from the public record. In 1986, faced with the absolute incontrovertible evidence provided entirely by his own physical archives, the disgraced pioneer leader was found guilty of the brutal murders of the 7 young boys and was immediately sentenced to death. After exhausting his final appeals to the Soviet leadership, Slivko was officially executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head in September 1989, permanently removing the architect of this decades-long nightmare from the face of the earth. The devastating legacy of his crimes fundamentally shattered the psychological security of the Nevinomist community, leaving the grieving families of the victims to endure the permanent, agonizing reality that their children's final moments of absolute terror were captured on celluloid. The dozens of young boys who miraculously survived his twisted experiments were left to carry profound, invisible psychological scars into adulthood, forever burdened by their intimate, horrifying proximity to one of the most prolific serial killers in Russian history. The true, unprecedented scope of the psychological damage inflicted upon the surviving youth remained largely unaddressed by a government that preferred to sweep the horrific scandal completely under the rug, rather than provide comprehensive mental health support. The 43 reels of film and the meticulously maintained journals were permanently confiscated by the state security apparatus, locked away in heavily restricted government vaults, to ensure the visual records of his atrocities would never again see the light of day. Slivko's unprecedented case stands as a terrifying testament to the severe dangers of unquestioned authority and the absolute vulnerability of children operating within highly isolated, closed systems where a predator can control the entire narrative. While this Soviet butcher utilized heavy analog equipment to build a solitary, entirely private cinematic archive of his individual power, the compulsion to actively record violence frequently manifests in even more complex, collaborative dynamics. This horrifying realization regarding the shared, mutual documentation of human suffering guides our narrative directly out of the secretive Eastern Bloc and into the seemingly perfect, pristine suburbs of North America, where a young, attractive couple concealed devastating, self-produced videotapes within the very architecture of their home. In the early 1990s, the picturesque, fiercely proud community of St. Catharines, Ontario, situated perfectly near the roaring majesty of Niagara Falls, served as the idyllic backdrop for what appeared to be the ultimate Canadian fairy tale romance. Paul Bernardo, a remarkably handsome, deeply charismatic accountant with an affinity for luxury vehicles and tailored suits, and Carla Homolka, a stunning, blonde veterinary assistant who radiated youthful innocence, actively projected the flawless image of a highly successful, intensely upward, mobile young couple. Their highly publicized, lavish fairy tale wedding, complete with horse-drawn carriages and an atmosphere of absolute cinematic perfection, cemented their status within their social circle as the quintessential embodiment of modern suburban success and domestic bliss. They resided in a pristine, meticulously decorated home located at 57 Bayview Drive in the quiet, affluent neighborhood of Port Dalhousie, a residence that featured a brightly painted pink exterior that perfectly masked the unimaginable, suffocating horrors being systematically engineered within its walls. To their neighbors, their families, and the wider community, Paul and Carla were an aspirational, fundamentally harmless duo who represented the absolute best of young, ambitious Canadian society, remaining entirely insulated from any suspicion of violent criminality. Beneath this carefully curated, fiercely protected veneer of suburban perfection, however, the couple harbored a deeply depraved, heavily collaborative sadism that required the absolute subjugation and physical destruction of innocent teenage girls to satisfy their mutual, escalating psychosexual compulsions. The terrifying reality was that the charming accountant had already established a horrific, undetected history as the notorious Scarborough rapist, and his union with the seemingly gentle veterinary assistant did not pacify his dark urges, but rather provided him with a willing, highly deceptive accomplice. Together, they transformed their picturesque suburban dwelling into a highly secure, soundproof dungeon, utilizing the inherent trust naturally afforded to an attractive, affluent couple to seamlessly lure, trap, and permanently erase vulnerable individuals who unfortunately crossed their path. The stark, terrifying contrast between the brightly lit, pastel-colored reality of their public existence and the pitch-black, deeply methodical nightmare they engineered behind locked doors created a perfect, impenetrable camouflage for their collaborative atrocities. This absolute illusion of normalcy allowed them to move through their community with devastating impunity, heavily insulating them from a desperate, sprawling police investigation that was fundamentally geared toward hunting a solitary, socially isolated monster rather than an attractive, married team operating from a pristine marital home. The fragile, deeply held illusion of safety within the Niagara region was violently and permanently shattered by a sudden, terrifying escalation of predatory violence that specifically targeted the most innocent, vulnerable members of the local community. In June of 1991, the community was plunged into a state of absolute, suffocating terror when 14-year-old Leslie Maffa, a bright, highly energetic teenager, vanished without a single trace from her own backyard, after simply returning home late from attending a memorial service. The agonizing, desperate search for the missing girl concluded in the most horrific manner imaginable weeks later, when her dismembered remains were tragically discovered encased within heavy concrete blocks submerged in the dark, murky waters of Lake Gibson. This catastrophic discovery served as the definitive, undeniable point of no return for local law enforcement and the surrounding community, instantly transitioning a localized missing persons inquiry into a frantic, high-stakes hunt for a highly organized, profoundly sadistic killer operating within their immediate geographical vicinity. The atmosphere of paralyzing paranoia reached an absolute fever pitch in April of 1992 when 15-year-old Kristen French, a beloved high school student known for her deep kindness and athletic ability, was brazenly abducted in broad daylight directly from the parking lot of a local church while walking home from school. Eyewitness accounts of a desperate physical struggle involving a seemingly ordinary, light-colored vehicle provided a terrifying confirmation that the predator was highly mobile, incredibly bold, and actively hunting within the perceived safe zones of the bustling suburban landscape. The sudden, agonizing disappearance of a second innocent teenage girl triggered a massive, unprecedented mobilization of community resources, leading to the widespread distribution of green ribbons worn by thousands of citizens as a desperate, visual symbol of hope and collective vigilance. However, behind the heavily drawn blinds of the Pink House on Bayview Drive, Paul and Carla were actively subjecting their captives to unimaginable, highly documented psychological and physical torment, completely insulated from the massive dragnet furiously operating just outside their front door. The police, operating under the deeply flawed assumption that serial predators fit a specific, solitary profile, continuously failed to look toward the successful, attractive young couple, allowing the horrific, collaborative nightmare to proceed entirely unchecked. This critical, systemic blindness perfectly illustrates the catastrophic danger of relying entirely on preconceived criminal archetypes, as the most lethal, highly organized threats frequently disguise themselves flawlessly within the deeply trusted, seemingly mundane architecture of everyday civilian life. As the heavily funded Green Ribbon Task Force desperately chased down thousands of frantic tips and interviewed countless potential suspects, the meticulously constructed, highly collaborative facade of the Bernardo Homolka partnership slowly began to fracture from within under the immense, crushing weight of their shared atrocities. The deeply toxic, inherently volatile nature of their relationship rapidly devolved into severe, escalating domestic violence, completely shattering the pristine illusion of their fairy tale marriage, as Paul's absolute need for physical control eventually turned directly toward his own willing accomplice. In early 1993, a particularly brutal, highly aggressive physical altercation left Carla Homolka severely beaten and heavily bruised, prompting her terrified family members to immediately intervene and forcing her to seek emergency medical treatment at a local hospital. This seemingly routine, unfortunately common instance of severe domestic assault provided the critical, totally unexpected vulnerability that the sprawling homicide investigation desperately required to finally breach the impenetrable perimeter of the Pink House on Bayview Drive. Realizing with absolute certainty that her marriage was permanently destroyed, and fearing that she might inevitably become the next victim to be encased in concrete, Carla initiated a highly calculated, deeply manipulative dialogue with law enforcement from the safety of her hospital bed. She actively presented herself exclusively as a terrified, heavily coerced victim of profound domestic abuse, carefully feeding the desperate detectives just enough horrifying information regarding Paul's direct involvement in the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French to secure her own legal immunity. Operating under immense public pressure to definitively solve the horrific schoolgirl murders and entirely lacking the critical physical evidence required to fully comprehend the true, collaborative nature of the crimes, the Crown hastily negotiated a highly controversial, legally binding agreement that would forever haunt the Canadian justice system. In exchange for her primary testimony explicitly detailing Paul's singular role as the violent architect of the nightmare, Carla secured a shockingly lenient plea deal, fundamentally known as the deal with the devil, which promised her a vastly reduced sentence of merely 12 years for manslaughter. This strategic, highly self-serving legal maneuver successfully shifted the entire, catastrophic weight of the impending prosecution directly onto her husband, completely obscuring her own enthusiastic, highly active participation in the torture, and actively deceiving the very investigators who believed they had finally unraveled the region's darkest mystery. The absolute, staggering climax of the entire investigation did not occur within the tense, highly publicized confines of a courtroom, but rather during a deeply exhaustive, secondary forensic sweep of the abandoned, heavily scrutinized residence at 57 Bayview Drive long after the initial plea deal had been permanently signed. Detectives, acting on a critical, belated tip provided by Bernardo's own defense attorneys regarding hidden evidence, returned to the heavily dismantled master bedroom, meticulously searching for any remaining fragments of the couple's heavily documented nightmare. As investigators carefully examined the architectural structure of the room, they completely removed a recessed pot light fixture from the ceiling, reaching deep into the dark, dusty cavity to miraculously discover a meticulously concealed, terrifying cache of 6 microcassette videotapes. When the specialized forensic technicians finally played these heavily degraded, fiercely protected analog tapes, they were instantly subjected to the most visceral, uncompromising, and absolutely undeniable visual evidence of collaborative, pure evil ever recovered in Canadian history. The grainy, horrifying footage definitively proved beyond any shadow of a judicial doubt that Karla Homolka was not a terrified, heavily battered captive forced into compliance, but rather an active, deeply enthusiastic, and chillingly cruel participant who personally facilitated the drugging, extreme assault, and psychological destruction of the young victims. The recovered tapes provided an airtight, deeply agonizing visual record of the final, terrifying days of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, capturing the absolute, uncompromising sadism of a couple who required the permanent documentation of their power to validate their twisted bond. Furthermore, the video archives contain the most devastating, unimaginable revelation of all definitive, incontrovertible proof that Karla had actively procured, drugged, and eagerly participated in the fatal sexual assault of her own younger sister, Tammy Homolka, years prior, entirely refuting her previous claims of innocence. The discovery of these hidden cassettes sent a profound, inescapable shockwave of sheer horror through the ranks of law enforcement and the prosecuting attorneys, who suddenly realized with absolute, crushing certainty that they had inadvertently granted profound leniency to one of the most prolific, heavily documented monsters in the country. This catastrophic revelation completely shattered the fabricated narrative of the coerced wife, fundamentally transforming the entire scope of the legal proceedings and proving that the most deeply guarded secrets of a highly organized killer are frequently preserved on the very magnetic tape they utilized to immortalize their absolute dominance. The subsequent, highly explosive trial of Paul Bernardo in 1995 was entirely defined by the agonizing, mandatory presentation of the sealing videotapes, which systematically dismantled his defense and provided the traumatized jury with an absolutely flawless, irrefutable narrative of premeditated, aggravated murder. Bernardo was definitively convicted on all primary charges, officially designated as a dangerous offender under Canadian law, and sentenced to life in prison, with virtually no realistic possibility of ever attaining parole, ensuring he would spend the absolute remainder of his natural life heavily isolated within a maximum security penitentiary. The overwhelming, completely justified public outrage regarding the case was heavily directed at the devastating reality of the deal with the devil, as the Canadian justice system was legally forced to honor the original plea agreement, despite the undeniable, horrific evidence of Karla Homolka's active, enthusiastic complicity. Homolka ultimately served her highly controversial, tragically brief 12-year sentence in its entirety, quietly slipping out of the prison system and eventually relocating under a completely assumed identity, leaving a permanent, deeply agonizing scar on the collective conscience of a nation that felt fundamentally betrayed by the legal process. The grieving families of Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and Tammy Homoka were forced to endure not only the unimaginable, permanent physical loss of their beloved children, but also the deeply horrifying knowledge that their final, agonizing moments were meticulously preserved on analog tape by the very architects of their destruction. In a deeply symbolic, highly necessary act of communal healing and absolute erasure, the pristine, pink-painted house at 57 Bayview Drive was completely demolished by authorities, permanently obliterating the physical structure of the nightmare and ensuring the property could never be utilized as a macabre shrine by those obsessed with the dark realities of the case. The enduring legacy of the hidden ceiling tapes fundamentally altered how global law enforcement views the deeply complex, often deceptive dynamics of collaborative, sexually motivated serial killers, definitively proving that visual evidence remains the absolute, uncompromising arbiter of truth in the darkest corners of human behavior. The undeniable compulsion to hit the record button and capture the absolute terror of another human being ultimately served as the definitive instrument of their own judicial ruin, permanently locking their legacy to the magnetic tape they so desperately sought to hide. This profound, deeply unsettling reality surrounding the preservation of terror perfectly sets the stage for our final examination of the heavy psychological toll these specific archives inevitably demand from the world. The chilling archives left behind by these predators serve as a permanent, haunting reminder that the most terrifying monsters are driven not just by a compulsion to destroy life, but by a deeply psychological need to immortalize their absolute control over it. As we finally close the vault on these meticulously documented nightmares, one deeply unsettling question remains to linger in the shadows of our modern, hyper-connected world. What other horrific secrets are currently being recorded and quietly locked away right next door? Thank you for watching.